Order. Order. I call Mr Paul Scully to move the motion on behalf of the Petitions Committee.
Thank you, Mr Hanson. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petitions 229963, 221747, 235185, 232984, 231461, 226509 and 236261. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Hanson, and I think those list of numbers there shows how Brexit still exercises our nation. And if I would just indulge you, which will probably take longer than my speech, I'll just read some of the text of the petitions into the debate so that you can see exactly what we're talking about. Because we've themed them. Not all of these petitions have reached 100,000 signatures, but they were similar enough to be put into the three categories that we're trying to cover, with others that had reached that threshold that the Petitions Committee then considers them. So we have the first one, which is leave the EU without a deal in March 2019, saying we're wasting billions of pounds of taxpayers' money trying to negotiate in a short space of time. Leaving the EU in March 2019 will allow the UK good time to negotiate more efficiently. The EU will be more eager to accept a deal on our own terms, having lost a major partner. We'll save billions of pounds from our EU divorce payments, as well as a similar amount from civil service and government costs. This money will be used to support our own country, whilst we await the EU to talk to us to make deals more in our favour. The EU border in Ireland to be managed simply by having a dual euro-pound currency as legal tender in both the north and south. Exports to the south would be dealt with in euro and vice versa when importing to the north. Rates fixed at time of deal. Then there's one with similar one saying leave the EU now, which simply says the government is not going to achieve a satisfactory outcome from its negotiations with the EU. We should walk away now. No deal is better than a bad deal. Third one, similar again, walk away now. We voted for a no-deal Brexit. Theresa May has failed to negotiate a Brexit deal that's acceptable to Parliament and the British people. The withdrawal agreement doesn't deliver the Brexit we voted for. It's clear that the EU is not going to offer anything else, particularly regarding the backstop. The government must now be prepared to walk away from the negotiations. No deal is better than the deal that's been negotiated. No deal is also what we voted for. Give the people what they voted for. Anything less is not Brexit. Then we move to the second group of petitions, which is all about the second referendum that people have talked about. Grant a people's vote if Parliament rejects the EU withdrawal agreement. The Prime Minister has negotiated an EU withdrawal agreement. However, it's clear from resignations and interviews that the deal would not pass Parliament. As no credible alternative has been proposed, the public must be allowed to vote on whether to accept this deal or remain in the UK. Dominic Raab's resignation is perhaps the strongest indication that the withdrawal agreement will not be approved by Parliament. However, he is responsible for this deal as former Brexit Secretary, which suggests that a better deal is not possible. The only better deal is to remain in the EU on similar terms to what we have now, not in Schengen, not in the Euro, deciding on EU legislation. Another one on the second referendum says it's no secret that a vast amount of people who voted to leave the EU didn't realise what they were voting for. The Leave campaign said that leaving would create new trade deals, strengthen the economy and public services, and reduce the number of incoming immigrants. But this is not happening. Theresa May has really struggled so far in Brexit negotiations, and time is running out. She's failing to secure trade deals, and my personal biggest fear is the Irish border. This could lead to a united Ireland. May has lost support not only from Cabinet but the whole nation. I'm calling for a second referendum. This is still in quotes, you understand. Because if you voted to remain or leave, we need a final say. The Brexit decision was so tight, and I just think that it will help everyone if there was a second vote. Sign if you agree. And then the third pair of petitions is about stopping Brexit in its entirety. It's so desperately simple. The government's standard response to these kind of petitions is the British people voted to leave the EU and the government respect that decision. But the government themselves do not know the outcome of that decision, so how can they possibly respect it? Quote Theresa May, "We do not know what the outcome will be. The referendum was advisory, not conclusive. The result of the referendum has now been proven to be illegally biased, something our government is choosing to ignore. Hence the vote, actually an opinion poll, is now null and void. The referendum was voted for without any indication of actual facts. 2 years ago, there was still no detail about what Brexit actually entailed. Today, still no detail. For all these reasons, stop Brexit." And finally, a short one. Stop Brexit if Parliament rejects the deal. Brexit is not worth it. A hard border in Ireland will destroy the Good Friday Agreement. Meds are being stockpiled, and there's news that a contract has been given to a company with no ferries, and the army is on standby in the event of no deal too. Stop Brexit if MPs vote to reject the PM's deal. So as you can see, that's the first 5 minutes done, just reading out those 7 petitions, none of which agree with each other. So you can see where we are as a country. So when we talk about this place, we are really reflecting the views of what is happening outside here as well. And those petitions have ranged from, I think 6,000 was the smallest petition, up to 330,000 signatures for the highest. And there's any number of people that have been supporting these petitions. So that's what's great about these debates, actually. We are able to talk in this place, in these Petitions Committee debates, about things that people have asked us to speak about. Now, if you look at the government deal that we're all debating in Parliament today, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's not so many members in this chamber at the moment, because the Prime Minister's on her feet making a statement about the last assurances that she's had from the EU. People will be raising questions with her, and then the debate will continue, and obviously we'll have that vote tomorrow. Now, the government debate, the deal, is undoubtedly a compromise. I campaigned to leave, I voted to leave, but this is still in my place. I will be voting for the deal tomorrow, because I see it as the best way to leave in an orderly fashion. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it could be good. It could be made good in the second half of the negotiation. Unfortunately, people that are bored of Brexit, we're only halfway through. Because if we can get something through to the next stage with an agreement, then we have to deal with the future relationship with the EU. And that will take time to get through a trade deal and all of the finer points of security, education, cooperation, research cooperation, and these sort of things as well. But to my mind, and why I voted to leave, I look at this deal, when I was looking at how I was going to vote tomorrow, I was thinking, well, does it fulfil the reasons that I voted to leave? And then can I look other people in the eye and say, yes, it does? So it leaves the EU political institutions. That was the biggest thing that drove me from when I voted for the referendum party back in 1997, which is what got me into party politics in the first place, because this is my penance, actually, for having brought in a Labour government and a Lib Dem local MP. So I wanted to leave the political institutions. This allows us to do that. This allows us to end the huge membership fees that are paying into the EU as well. It helps us, it enables us to end freedom of movement. It enables us to start negotiating trade deals and even ratifying those trade deals. But of course, we can't put them into place until we've left the implementation phase, and as long as the backstop doesn't come in, if we have a deal in place with the EU, then we can move on to putting those independent trade deals in place. That's why it's imperfect, to my mind, because I would have hoped by now, if I'm looking back 2 years ago, I'd have hoped we could have got to that place now. But my decision is taken on the point that it's where we are now, not where we started off. We got stuck on the sequencing, the fact that we couldn't have the twin track debate on our future relationship as well as withdrawing. And then we did get stuck on the Irish backstop last year, which has suddenly become a thing over the last year, and now I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that actually we're just going to be able to remove the backstop because we don't like it. I understand the arguments about the fact that we cannot unilaterally leave the backstop, which is concerning a lot of people naturally. But then it's why I've been asking a lot of questions of ministers, of the Prime Minister and other people, when it just simply says in the explanation around the backstop as to why the EU, both parties, find it uncomfortable. That's not good enough for me. I want to know why they find it uncomfortable. So I've been asking questions and looking at it in a little bit closer detail. And it's interesting to look at the fact that politically, the backstop is incredibly difficult for unionists. Economically, it's actually pretty advantageous to Northern Ireland, should it ever come in. Why? Because should it come in, Northern Ireland automatically overnight becomes the most competitive part of Europe. We as a country, because the fact that the part of the thing that the EU compromised, that we as a whole country get brought into the backstop, it means that we can have full access, having left, to the single market and the customs union without paying any membership fees. Now, imagine what France, for example, would think about that. For once, France are subsidising us by they're still paying full membership fees for the same benefit, or same access than we are. They can't be that comfortable about that. We won't have freedom of movement, but we still have that same access. So we're actually breaking one of the pillars of the EU. The thing, if you remember back to the beginning Mr. Hanson, of the referendum debates, the EU said we will not allow the UK to cherry pick. That's exactly what happens under that system. We are cherry picking because we still have access, but we don't have freedom of movement and we don't have that payment. So whilst the rhetoric, in my mind, is sufficient to prove to people that they are punishing us for leaving, the actuality, what's down in a bit of paper is inconvenient, but it's in no way punishing us for that long term. Finally, as well, why did the EU find the backstop uncomfortable? Because suddenly the whole of the UK becomes their backstop should they want to strike further trade deals with other countries. Other countries that are trying to look to the EU to finalise their trade deals will say, OK, we understand how we're going to trade with you, what that's going to be like, but what about that corner on the top left of the map there? What about the whole of the UK? What's their relationship going to be with you? We don't really understand this. And so that's going to mean that they will drag their heels even further than they do now. Now, so if we're going to leave with no deal, some people will call it WTO. I was just having a Twitter chat, shall we say, earlier on as I was preparing this with a constituent who was talking about the fact that, well, it's not no deal, it's WTO arrangements, which is fine. You can call it what you want, but actually WTO arrangements doesn't cover non-trade issues. WTO is only about trade, so it doesn't cover the withdrawal agreement. It goes so much further than just trade. But if we do end up with no deal, I am comfortable to leave with no deal, should we be properly prepared, and should we have done everything that we can to have as an orderly departure as we can. And the withdrawal agreement, as I say, whilst not perfect, allows us, I believe, to do that. There will be short-term turbulence, and I think anybody that's proposing a no deal has to recognise the fact that there will be short-term turbulence. And one of the reasons that I'm uncomfortable about having it as my first position is because this will affect real people. When I come to make my vote, to cast my vote, I always have to have that first in my mind, first and foremost in my mind. What's it going to be for my constituents? What's it going to be for actual people? Not just something on a bit of paper that will be okay later on. So there will be short-term turbulence. We can survive it. We will get through it. But nonetheless, I think there are better ways in the first instance for doing it. I don't think we'd be thanked short-term for doing it. I think if we have the confidence to say, you know what, we can leave on WTO terms and we can go it alone, we can work with our 192 other countries and strike our own trade deals, surely we should have that same confidence that we can actually get this deal through, go to the European Union and say, and with a different negotiating strategy, say to them, look, we want an overarching, ambitious trade deal with you that's actually going to work for both countries and how both blocks. And how would that work? How that different negotiation strategy work? Well, basically, we can't do it all within one small cabal of people. It doesn't make any sense that we have someone like Crawford Faulkner. We brought him in from New Zealand. He's a hugely experienced trade negotiator, and he's working on every other trade deal around the world, apart from the biggest one, the one next door. Surely that makes sense that he and Liam Fox's department, the Secretary of State's department, actually works on trade. We can then get the Brexit Secretary to work on the overarching issues. We can get the Defence Secretary. We can get the Home Secretary working on defence and immigration and security, and actually having a far wider reaching set of negotiations, which will help, as well as bringing in that expertise and bringing in a wider group of people. It will also help engender a trust, something that unfortunately is sadly lacking in this entire process. One of the reasons I think people can't get beyond a certain point in the debate, because no matter what is said, people just don't believe it. And this is the problem. So I think if we actually do, one of the things that people do talk about as well is the idea that they're concerned about them paying in the reported £39 billion in advance. If we bear in mind the implementation phase is nearly 2 years, that's effectively £24 billion of that is the equivalent of membership fees. So we're quibbling about £15 billion, which is still a lot of money. But it's not quite that same. I think we need to work out where that money is going, how it's actually coming about, and at what point we're going to be paying for that as well. Now, turning to the second referendum, this is something I've struggled to see. I've seen it increase in popularity, but I've struggled to see how it's going to get off the ground. Because clearly, anything like a second referendum or revoking Article 50 in its entirety needs to come from the government in the first place, because primary legislation will be needed. There's clearly no agreement on the question. I've had some people say to me, well, hold on a sec, in 2016, we had leave or remain. Well, leave won. So therefore, that's sorted. Surely remain shouldn't even be on the ballot paper. It should be just how we leave. There's other people, clearly, who have a slightly different point of view, shall we say, who have said, well, no, we don't want to have leave with no deal because the government shouldn't be leaving with no deal, so therefore it should be just between Remain and the Prime Minister's deal. So you can see all the vested interests. You're just back to the same vested interests that I started off talking about. And I just find the idea that people talk about the original referendum, saying how divisive it was, how terrible it was in terms of the quality of debate, both of which actually, frankly, are true. But then when they talk about the division, they say, I'll tell you what, let's do it all again. And I just know what's going to happen. It will just be about vassal state on one side and cliff edge on the other side. There'll be a lot of heat and no light whatsoever. Lord knows what the buses will do at that point. I tend to agree with one chap who said, I'm sorry, I'm not one of those people who thinks we should be calling for a second referendum. I think it would just look like the referendum was fought under rules that we agreed to. A result was delivered because we don't like it. Now we want to replay it again, which will simply entrench a view that we're some elite, that we don't want to pay attention to the people. That was the honourable member, the member for Streatham, who happens to be spearheading the People's Vote campaign as we speak, I should think. So, it's unlikely to resolve anything. Similarly, in the same way, I don't believe a general election would resolve anything. And this is where we come to an issue why this place is so divided, because there is a lot of self-interest at the moment. You have the Labour Party, which, frankly, the leader of the opposition could literally draft his own deal, hand it over to the Prime Minister, who would then put it to the vote, and he'd still vote against it, because he wants a general election. That's all. You've obviously got splits within the opposition, with people wanting a people's vote. Usually those people that want a people's vote, the reason they want to avoid a general election, because it will be their worst nightmare. It risks a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, who are the leader of the opposition, who I don't think those people that are proposing a people's vote in the opposition particularly want, because they're not exactly close, shall we say. You then have the Liberal Democrats, you have the Scottish National Party that basically want to pretend this never happened. And they just want to unpick the referendum, for their various reasons, want not to leave the EU. At least that, frankly, is an honest position. When you have the Lib Dems saying something like, oh, let's have a people's vote, then they've got hashtag exit from Brexit. I think that clearly demonstrates the angle that they're actually coming from. I'm yet to meet someone that voted to leave, that still intends to leave, that says, I'll tell you what, just before we do, shall we just test the waters? Shall we have a second referendum? I've yet to meet that person. It's inevitably people that just want to have that Bobby Ewing moment when they can wake up and find he's still in the shower. Absolutely. He's done that. And finally, as I say, those people are just wanting to unlock and unpick the referendum, the people that want to revoke Article 50. At least they are being honest. At least they are explaining their true intentions. But that will have severe consequences. The Archbishop of York himself talked about the second referendum potentially causing civil unrest. And if we had a situation where we have come to this place, we've listened to people, 17.4 million people, put their trust in us that we will do what they've asked us to do, what they've mandated us to do. Because that's what that opinion poll talks about. One of the petitions talks about the fact that this was just an opinion poll. It wasn't. It was a national referendum, which is what it has the biggest mandate of anything that's happened that people have voted for in this country. We had, I can't remember the figures, but we had any number of members of Parliament queuing up to vote to invoke Article 50 in the first place, which was taking that referendum and actually putting it into legislation, actually making our voice and their voice heard. And so that's why we need to redouble our efforts. We need to find a deal that works so that we can leave the EU in the most orderly fashion possible, demonstrate to people that we can do this. We can respect their wishes and make sure that we can then move on and gain the benefits that we'll inevitably have from leaving the EU. Thank you.
Well, the question is that this House has considered e-petitions 229963, 221747 and 235185 relating to leaving the EU without a withdrawal agreement, 232984 and 241361 relating to holding a further referendum on leaving the EU, and 226509 and 236261 relating to not leaving the EU. I call Mr. Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. I agree with much of what the Honourable Member for Sutton and Jean said, except his final conclusion that somehow this deal is a way forward. There are a number of reasons why it isn't the way forward, Mr. Hanson. The first one is that it's not a deal. This is an agreement to have negotiations for a final deal, not a deal itself. And as Neil Warnock, who I'm not used to quoting, for his political stance, the manager of Cardiff City, I'm not even used to quoting him on football matters. But I thought he spoke for probably the majority of the United Kingdom on Sunday when he said the people of the United Kingdom decided in a referendum the government should get on and implement it. After 2.5 years, that should be the case. The government haven't implemented it. They've come back with an agreement to negotiate, which I have to say, the Prime Minister should be embarrassed, having come back with an agreement to negotiate which leaves control of the end of that negotiations and whether Northern Ireland has different laws to the rest of the United Kingdom, subject to a different legislature. That is an outrage. It's an embarrassment to the Prime Minister and a disgrace to the country that anybody of whichever political party would bring back a deal like that, Mr. Hanson. Now, the debate and the petitions range all over the place, but I think it's worth going back to the referendum itself. The wording of the referendum was unambiguous and unconditional. There was no condition on the ballot paper, and it was absolutely clear if people voted one way, they were voting to remain in the EU. If they voted in the other box, they were voting to leave. And certainly the Prime Minister has not managed to deliver that. Since that time, we've had a vote to trigger Article 50, passed by a huge majority. But what has also happened is that those people who essentially, not in every case, Mr. Hanson, but in many cases, were Remainers, have looked for ways to undermine the decision. And although it was unconditional and unambiguous, there have been a number of statements made which at first sight sound quite sensible. I hear it regularly in the chamber, I've heard it in this chamber. People didn't vote to make themselves poorer. Well, no, they didn't. It's true. They didn't vote to make themselves richer. They voted to leave the European Union. The implication of the statement that they didn't vote to make themselves poorer is that somehow, well, there are two implications really. One is that people never vote to make themselves poorer, so it would be absurd of any proposition to even think that. But a moment's thought shows that that absolutely isn't true. Everybody in present in this chamber, honourable and right honourable members, regularly stand on manifestos which have tax commitments in them. Tax commitments are a way of confiscating people's income and capital resources. It makes people poorer. So, yeah, we all vote for it. We stand on manifestos that make people poorer for a social benefit and a public benefit, usually. So I think it is a nonsensical statement that appears to have credibility, and who could disagree with it, which is the objective and purpose of it is to undermine the democratic decision. And as the honourable member said, taken by over 17.4 million people. The other implication that lies behind much of this is that somehow there is certainty being in the EU that it always makes us richer and it doesn't ever make us poorer. The decisions it makes are always to the benefit of the people of the United Kingdom and of the people of the EU. Well, I think that's demonstrably not true. As a Labour Party member for many, many years who opposed the monetarism of the early 80s, I am quite astonished that members of the Labour Party are so wedded to the EU, which at the core of its policies is the Stability and Growth Pact. The Stability and Growth Pact is, in fact, monetarism. It's Thatcherism internationalised. And it isn't just an abstract thought that it's one of the reasons that the youth across the whole of southern Europe have not only lost the democratic right to determine what happens in Greece and Italy and Portugal and Spain, you've got a whole generation of young people on the dole created by the macroeconomic policies at the centre of EU policy. So that's one reason that, and it's not just those people that are affected. By deflating the EU economy, it affects our ability to export there. So that's a macroeconomic. Let's look at, and there are many, many examples where some of the perverse decisions of the EU will and have led to job losses. I think it was in the summer, I can't remember the month of last year. The European Court of Justice, in line with what the EU Commission had saying, ruled on the CRISPR Cas9 technology, which is about inserting genetic parts of genes into crops, and they ruled it to be unlawful. It has been condemned widely throughout the scientific community, that decision, as being anti-scientific, having a chilling effect on research and the economy, whereas the rest of the world is happy to get on with it because they have seen that where this technology exists, it leads to a drop in the use of herbicides by about a third and a 20% increase in crops. So it is going to damage not just UK and European science, it is going to damage the jobs that are related to that, not just in science but in agriculture as well, and potentially lead to less food. And the extraordinary thing is that the CRISPR technology has been banned, in effect, while at the same time crops that have been created by random genetic mutation, by irradiation, so there's no control in what has happened, are allowed. And I use those, one at the huge end of the economy and one at a very specific part of science, to illustrate that it is nonsensical to think that the EU always makes decisions that lead to more jobs, more growth, better science. They simply do not. And I make those points because I believe fundamentally that you get better regulations if we make them for ourselves, for our own industry and our own science, not designed to fit across the whole of the 27/28 countries of the EU. The third argument that is used to argue for a second referendum, or that this referendum should not be implemented, the 2016 referendum shouldn't be implemented, is that people didn't understand what they were voting for. Well, I said earlier, Mr. Hanson, it was a simple proposition. And I think people did know what they were voting for. They were voting to leave the European Union. It's fairly clear to me, from having talked to people during the referendum, the people I represent from some of the poorest estates in the country, that they knew exactly what they were voting for. And it is an insult to those people to say that they didn't know what they're voting for, because what the implication is that the educated cosmopolitan elite are superior and that their votes should weigh more than the votes of the people without degrees and A-levels in the poorer parts of our country. And I don't believe that, and I guess, stated explicitly, most people in this room don't believe that. But again, that's what's at the base of the didn't understand it. And I ask you this question, Mr. Hanson. If people didn't understand a simple proposition like leaving the European Union, how are they going to understand the pre-negotiation agreement, which is it 585 pages long or 685 pages long of nonsensical, if you try to read it, legal script? They're not. It's a ludicrous proposition to pretend that that is easier to understand than a simple proposition. And if we're going to ignore the first referendum, what credibility would a second referendum have? And what credibility would any future referendum have? Would we have to say that if a referendum was agreed, then, well, we'll have one first, and then if it goes the way that the establishment don't like, then we'll make it the best of three, which is what the proposition for a second referendum is. So I don't think we should go down the process of a second referendum. We've had many debates on that in this room and on the floor of the House, and I don't think we should have another one. There is one further point I would like to make on the economic impact of the EU. It is assumed, again, not just that the EU is economically beneficial to us, but stopping the current trading arrangements where we're in the internal market with the EU would be wholly negative. Well, when we're running a huge trade deficit of between 70 and 80 billion a year, if you change the rules, I think, be a good thing anyway, you will get a lot of substitution. Jobs will be created here because any tariffs would mean that it would be cheaper, and possibly a drop in the pound, it would be cheaper to manufacture here. Why we consider it so economically advantageous to us to be in an internal market where we have a huge trade deficit, I don't know. So those are some of the reasons against the agreements to have a trade. I think it is also worth thinking about why the EU have done what they have done. We're in complete regulatory alignment with the EU. They have this trade surplus with us. We've been paying a lot of money into the EU. The reasons that a lot of the university exchanges work is our top universities, putting it bluntly, are better than the EU's universities. If you look at just simple, a simple criterion like the number of Nobel Awards, one college at Cambridge has won more Nobel Prizes than most of the than of the top universities within the EU. They need our universities. So what is motivating the EU Commission to be so unaccommodating in their negotiations? And I think it is simply this. It's not to do with trade. They're prepared to punish the EU citizens by coming to, from their point of view, a bad deal, because they've got this trade surplus, because they don't want any other states following our example. And if you look around the EU, I think it is partly the responsibility of the non-democratic nature of the EU. Not only have they got economic problems along the southern coast, they have the rise of the far right in many countries. It is extraordinary in my political lifetime, Mr. Hanson, that we now find a party of the far right in Sweden, and the fact that Sweden, one of the great democracies and long-standing democracies in Europe, can't form a government. And I think part of, it's not the only reason, there are other strands to the reasons why the right is going through a resurgence throughout Europe. But one of the reasons is people can no longer vote for governments that will do what they wish them to do, because these factors are determined by the EU. If it was to come to a no deal, and it would be better to have our cake and eat it, quite frankly, to have a deal which is beneficial to the citizens of the EU and beneficial to us, would it be the end of the world? I agree with the Honourable Member for Sutton and Cheam. It wouldn't. There would be some short-term disruption. Nothing like the disruption that the BBC are propagating. Nothing like the disruption and the cries of woe that one hears regularly on the floor of the House of Commons. But there is bound to be some disruption. We heard from the prefecture of Calais that there would be no halting of goods at Calais. And why would there be? Why would countries try to make it more difficult for their own industries to export? It has always been a put-up job that somehow the French wouldn't want to sell us wine in support of the European Commission. They would want to make the people producing their wine in Bordeaux and Burgundy and on the Rhone Valley poorer. This is an extraordinary proposition. And the same would be true of Spain and other European countries. So that isn't going to happen. But if you change anything, there would be some short-term disruption. I think because we would be making our own laws in a very short period of time, we would see major benefits. We would also keep most of the 39 billion, which the House of Lords Finance Subcommittee, I think it was, showed that we had no legal obligation to pay, and that would give us probably a 2% boost to our GDP. And incidentally, I think I'd go to Mystic Meg for predictions about the economy before I would go to the Bank of England, who said the mere vote of leaving the EU would lead to 500,000 job losses after June the 23rd. How many jobs were lost? More jobs were created. And yet people are regularly quoting on the floor of the House of Commons that we will have an economic disaster based not just on the Bank of England, based on other think tanks and institutions that are using the same failed models that don't allow for the flexibility and the substitution that there is in the market in this country. In a more general sense, most of our trade is done on World Trade Organization rules anyway. Most of the world trade on World Trade Organization rules. I'm not saying it's better than what we've got. It's not, but it's adequate. The car industry that has bleated quite a lot. Much of the imports do not come from parts, do not come solely from the EU. Some come from other parts of the world economy. And it's also, the rest of the world is where most of the growth is. The EU has been one of the slowest growing parts of the world economy. It's Asia, it's the United States, it's even South America, where most of the growth is occurring. So I don't think we have a great deal to be frightened about on those matters. I've covered a lot of ground, I think, Mr. Hanson. One could cover more because the petitions themselves cover a huge amount of ground, from petitions to saying to leaving to what the impact will be. But I hope I've given some views that are not the majority view in my party. They're not the majority view in the House of Commons, but they are, as the 2016 referendum showed, the majority view in the country. And if I can remind honourable members what the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, said, he said the people are sovereign. And the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central, in response, said this is not for members to decide, this is for you, the public, to decide what happens. So it would be quite wrong for us now to stop this. Sadly, the government have not come back with a deal after 2.5 years. And I will vote against what they have come back with, because I think if there's a general election, and I agree with my leader on this, a general election may well help to put pressure on the Commission. But one of the things we know about the EU, if this is rejected, and it's a pretty appalling deal, is the EU are masters and mistresses at the last-minute deal. The EU will suffer in absolute terms more than the UK, in percentage terms less, if there isn't a reasonable agreement on the 29th of March. So I don't think tomorrow is the end of the story. I think we should have said it, the Prime Minister should have said at the beginning, we're not accepting a ridiculous deal like this, and she needs to go back either to the Commission and get a better deal, or she needs to go back to the people, and hopefully the Labour Party would get a mandate to negotiate a better deal.
Andrew Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm going to speak in support of the petition that received over 300,000 signatures, that being regards to leaving on WTO. Mr. Chairman, clearly a free trade agreement with the EU is optimal, and I'm an economic liberal and I believe in the benefits of free trade and open markets. However, leaving the EU under the Prime Minister's deal will restrict our ability to further sign free trade agreements with the most exciting and fastest growing economies in the world, and this cannot be allowed to happen. The withdrawal deal will make the UK a vassal state, a country whose destiny is controlled by the EU and its institutions, and this cannot be allowed to happen as it is a sellout to the British people. Leaving on World Trade Organization terms should not panic the UK. There are positives to leaving under this deal when compared to the Prime Minister's disastrous deal. If we want to take back control of our money, our laws, our borders, and keep our £39 billion trade freely with the rest of the world, then a clean WTO Brexit will achieve this. Some in this place have warned that negotiating a new free trade agreement with third parties will be more difficult, and we will not be able to achieve as good a terms than negotiating through the European Union. But I believe this argument is flawed. We all know that the EU is cumbersome, they are bureaucratic and full of red tape. For free trade agreements to be signed off in the EU, they need to be approved by every member state. Therefore, the economies and priorities of 27 nations, including individual regions, need to be considered. When negotiating our own free trade deals, we can be proactive and seek out opportunities. We can be flexible whilst the EU is rigid. We can be fast and nimble while the EU is slow and cumbersome. The UK will be free and liberated to sign free trade agreements with the exciting economies of tomorrow. Let us not talk down the UK. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. We are a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we speak the global language of business. We have world-class universities, we have an incredible global reach, and we sit at the heart of the Commonwealth, which is home to 2.4 billion citizens. I could not be more proud to say that I am British and I believe in Great Britain and the United Kingdom. And we will succeed no matter what our future lies. We will prevail because it is the British people where our strength and dynamism lies, not in being part of the European Union. Mr. Chairman, the reason we are here today is because the Prime Minister's deal has failed, and she's failed to achieve a deal which is good for the UK. But this is the deal before us. The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has stated, "I'm totally convinced that this is the only deal possible." The EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, has told the European Parliament the treaty that is on the table is the only deal possible. And the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has said that the deal agreed is the only possible one. Our Prime Minister has said that this is the only possible deal. But let us not forget what the opposition's Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade said about the Labour's Brexit plan. I won't use a swear word in in the chamber, what they used. Yeah, okay. Therefore, by conclusion, if politicians want to respect the outcome of the referendum, then WTO becomes a legitimate option, and it is right that we are here today discussing it. The world has benefited hugely from considerable progress that has been made in trade liberalisation in the last 70 years, but multilateral liberalisation has slowed and it now needs a new champion. The UK can be that champion. The benefits of free trade are clear to see. The world needs a liberalising voice, and the UK can be that voice at a time when open markets are being threatened. The UK will prosper as a WTO member and can immediately start further liberalisation with other WTO members on day one. Tariffs are a concern for some, and I recognise that, but please keep in mind my desire to see less tariffs and less restrictions to trade. Currently, under WTO rules, tariffs vary significantly by sector, but we need to see the bigger picture. In the 1980s, the EU's share of world GDP was around 30%. In 2017, it was around 16%. And by 2022, this is expected to fall further to 15%. The EU has a shrinking share of world trade, and Brexiteers can see the benefits of trading freely with the rest of the world, which is growing at a much faster rate than the EU. The organisation Economists for Free Trade recently released a detailed report which considered the many implications of leaving the EU on WTO terms. In my view, this report shows that although a deal is preferable, we have nothing to fear by leaving on these terms. From an economic perspective, the report showed that under WTO, we would actually be more prosperous as a country than we are now, and a lot better off than under the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, which would leave us worse off by a staggering 100 billion. The report also showed that under a no-deal, consumer prices would fall by 8%, and there would be an additional boost to the poorest households by 15%. And I know that many of my constituents would welcome this at a time when ordinary families are feeling the pressure. It is important to note that British exports to WTO countries have grown 3 times faster than those to the European single market since the mid-1980s. In fact, our biggest overseas market is America, and we trade with it on WTO terms. All of this taken together demonstrates that, despite of all the fear-mongering and demonisation of no deal, the reality is that is nothing to fear. We already conduct much of our trade under these terms, which are essentially a set of global enforceable rules that outlaw protectionist tricks, discriminatory tariffs and bureaucratic hurdles. Free and fair trade for both of us and global partners is the achieved result. After we leave, trade between the UK and EU can move to World Trade Organization rules, and this would mean tariffs averaging about 3%. There are some products which have high tariffs, for example, cars 10% and a 4.5% tariff on components from the EU. However, car companies can withstand a 10% tariff on sales into the EU because they've already benefited from a 15% depreciation in sterling. And border checks on components from the EU will be unnecessary, counterproductive for EU exporters, and also illegal under WTO rules, which prohibits unnecessary checks. The heads of firms such as Dyson, JCB, Northern Ireland's Wrightbus support Brexit because they can see the long-term benefits of us being free from the EU's red tape. A WTO Brexit can achieve this. The decision to leave the EU may have been one that I agreed with, but it is the British people, not politicians in this place, that decided to leave, and their decision must be upheld. Mr. Chairman, I was only elected in this place in 2015. I'm not a career politician, and I've never worked in the Westminster bubble before being elected. I may not have had the traditional route into politics, but I strongly think that that is positive. Trust in elected politicians is vital. If the public are going to have faith in this place, in the democratic process, and trust in us as their elected representatives, then I aim to uphold that trust. It is naive to think that we know better. No, Mr. Chairman, my constituents, they know best. They know how best to run their lives, how to spend their money, and they know what is best for their country. They voted for Brexit, and Brexit must prevail, be that under WTO Brexit or a better deal than the Prime Minister's deal. My constituency voted in favour of leaving the EU, Yorkshire and Humber region voted in favour of leaving the EU, and the country voted to leave the EU. We need to leave the European Union and its institutions and take advantage of the opportunities that Brexit can deliver. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to see a deal. A vision like the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech would have satisfied the referendum result. However, the Prime Minister has decided mistakenly to no longer pursue that vision. Moving to WTO rules will achieve that global Britain vision. We want to be in Europe, but not run by Europe. We want to be a truly global free trading powerhouse, and this still can be achieved. This can only be achieved by trading under WTO organisation rules. Let us now look to the future so we all can be free from the EU, free to make our own decisions, and free to chart our own destiny. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Hodson. I think it's maybe the first time I've served under your chairship, but it's a pleasure to do so. I'm a patriot. I love my country. I believe that serving your neighbours, serving your estate, serving your city, and serving your country is, the most important thing you can do, and the thing I think is the most important thing I can do with my life. And so that's why I come here every week. It's why I leave my family on a Monday morning and come back whenever I do, desperately hoping I'll get back at the time I've said I've done and not break any promises along the way. I find that's the best way to do it. But we come this week, and we've been coming for multiple weeks, but certainly this week we come at a significant crossroads. We have a number of paths ahead of us. Each have their own advantages, each have their own disadvantages. Some options will please some people, other options will please other people, and none of them will please everybody. In fact, presumably every option is going to anger significant portions of our society. And I say that as preamble because I was conscious, and other honourable members may have been conscious, that over Christmas when they talked to their friends and, in a more relaxed setting, that question would come up. People would desperately try not to talk about Brexit to you, but somebody eventually would say, why is it taking so long? And this debate and the petitions that sit behind it are precisely why it's taking so long. It is difficult, it is unclear, there are multiple points of view, and that's why I came to this debate today, because I think it really neatly encapsulates it all, because whether it's the Prime Minister's deal, no deal, a new deal, another vote, all of those options have things going for them, and I know that's not a very popular thing to say, but I believe that to be true. But all of them also have lots and lots not going for them, and those who support these options do so with a very deep passion, but those who don't often oppose them with a very deep anger. And I believe that virtually everybody does so in the sincerely held belief that their course is the correct one. It was really interesting in the Honourable Gentleman for Sutton and Cheam's very, very skillful introduction, how to introduce a debate that covers such a broad and contrasting set of views. But in each of those petition headers were things asserted as facts that others would say were not facts. And that is why this makes it very, very difficult. And that's why it's up to us in this place You know, as leaders, as people who put our hands up and said, we want to lead in our local community, we want to lead in aggregate in our country, to pick through and arrive at a solution that serves our nation's best interests, as patriots, as people who care about our countries and our communities. And tomorrow we will have the first stage in that, the first test of that, the first choice laid out in front of us, whether we accept the Prime Minister's deal or whether we do not. I will be voting against the Prime Minister's deal. I cannot, in good conscience, bind our nation to a 585-page legally binding withdrawal agreement in pursuit of a well-meant but non-binding political declaration. I believe this document threatens our historic union and frankly pleases or delivers for neither those who wish to leave nor those who wish to remain. And that's the sum total of 31 months of negotiation. You know, as my honourable friend from Manchester Blakely said, rather probably more artfully than me, it's a pre-agreement rather than a deal. And that's 31 months. So do we think by the end of 2020 we're going to have a comprehensive deal negotiated? No, of course we won't. I don't think anybody believes that. So we exercise the extension. Do we think we'll have done it by the end of 2022? Well, CETA took 5 years of pure negotiation, and that's if you really start at the most narrowest definition. Do we think we're going to do it in less than 4? Is there anything that's happened that suggests that so? Isn't there just, and before Christmas, myself and the honourable gentleman, the member for Mansfield, were on our local television, as we often are. I think it's something to do with being younger members that we always seem to get paired up together, so in 2x2s. And we agree, I'm sure, on many things in the world in general, but when it comes to political matters, the honourable gentleman and I disagree on quite a few of them. And but the one thing in our discussion on Notts TV about this issue and about where Brexit would go in the new year that we agreed we were getting towards agreement were that actually the withdrawal agreement as is may become so attractive in time to the EU 27 that actually becomes the deal itself. And that getting out of it, the honourable member for Morley and Outwood said that, you know, to get deals done with the EU takes all 27 others to consent. Actually, to think that not one at any point might think, you know what, we've actually got quite a good relationship here. Why don't we just stick with it? I think that's a real risk. And again, a reason why I don't think it's worth supporting the deal. I mean, I read, you know, as I do at every stage and take seriously what the Prime Minister's said earlier today, obviously not seen what's been said in the Chamber, but I suspect it were very closely related. And of course, I've read the letters from the European Council. And I don't take much comfort from these either. I understand where they come from and I understand the sort of the intentions behind them. But we know, because she said it, that the Prime Minister herself will not be here at the end of 2022. And how many more on that European Council, how many more leaders will have gone by then? Plenty. So I cannot, in good conscience, I'm surprised anybody really would be persuaded by doing this, to swap the certainty and law of what's going to happen in our country in our future for the assurances on a letterhead of people who may well not, many of whom we know will not be here at the time. That seems to me a very poor trade. So let's say, and you know, we know what's been said for a long time now. So let's say the deal falls tomorrow, which is the more probable outcome. No deal is not an option and should not be an option. We've talked, you know, the trade arguments are well played out. I went to see Toyota at the end of last year outside Derby to see their just-in-time manufacturing operating model. It was clear that any delay put into the system would be very injurious for them. Tariff barriers have been mentioned, and the shock to the economy of tariff barriers will be felt by my community, one of the poorest in the country. That can't happen. So we talk about the economic impact a lot, and that's happened in the discussion so far. We very rarely talk about the security implications of no deal. On the Home Affairs Select Committee, we did a very good report into this. We took lots of very good evidence from people who had differing views. But what was really clear, you know, the Schengen Information System too, which makes sure that violent criminals, possible terrorists, paedophiles from other countries can't get in. That system, that we check, when someone presents at a UK port, we check this database 500 million times a year, Mr. Hanson, to say that this individual comes, wants to get into our country, gets the tap on the shoulder, and then goes to a side room, doesn't come into our country. The sort of thing that we don't know about, but actually that keeps us safe in our beds. And we talk about WTO terms for trade, and I didn't agree with the honourable member for Morley and Outwood's argument, but I respected it, and it was well made. But there is no WTO fallback for security. So I know and I understand and I take as a valid option that people will push for a no-deal option. I understand that and I get emails to that effect. But those who do so ought to explain for security how we will, at 12:01, a minute after we've left the EU, if there are fireworks, whatever going on, when someone presents at a port that previously would have got that tap on the shoulder, would not have come into our country. How will that happen? And that, I believe, is a really, really critical answer, because I don't think there is one, and certainly in our committee's reporting we couldn't find one, and as a result I don't think any responsible government ought to countenance it. So putting that to one side and moving through, on these benches, it's well known we're seeking general election, as the honourable gentleman said, so that we could secure new leadership on this issue and, of course, many, many others, and we're probably not the moment to go through them now. But again, saying, and I'm not averse to a trip to the bookies, Mr Hanson, and I'm very aware that the bookies don't think we're going to win on our pursuit of a general election any more than the Prime Minister is likely to win tomorrow night. So let's say that both of those fall. What happens then? That means that come Wednesday or onwards and into early next week, we are, as Parliament as a whole, going to have a real job to find something that respects the referendum result but doesn't damage our country. And I appeal, and this is why I'm here today, and I take the chance to speak to and engage with government front benches when I can, for a change of tone. And I say this very personally. There's no sort of party politics in this. This is my personal feelings. It's culmination of 18 months of frustration, because I feel that we have been derided throughout this process. I was elected in the June 2017 election, and since then, I feel that on our benches we've been told we can't count. We've been told we don't read the documents. That's always a good one. We're told we're not being honest in our intentions, and that actually, when we say we're pursuing one goal, we're pursuing a second secret goal, or that we're playing politics in what we do. I believe these to be unfair and untrue charges. I don't, as I said at the beginning, I come here because I want to serve my city, my community. I believe the government will have to change its tone, because, frankly, come whether it's Wednesday morning, Thursday morning, or into next week, the government is going to need support from opposition benches. I don't think it takes some sort of strategic political genius, because in which case I'm not one, to say that actually after this, if we're getting to the point where we know what there isn't a majority for in Parliament, so we know there's not a majority we may well find for the Prime Minister's deal, we know from last week there's not one for no deal, if it shows that there's not one for a general election either, we become defined by what we know there isn't a majority for, but we're going to have to start to look what there is a majority for. So you start with the biggest blocks, that's the government's payroll vote and the opposition front bench. Those are the biggest blocks. The government is going to have to engage with the opposition on the terms that, I know we get derided for not having a position on Brexit, but again, it's been on the website, Mr Hudson, for a long time now, what our priorities are. We've been talking about the customs union for a long time, talked about migration, for rights at work, of course.
I'm grateful for him giving way, and he's absolutely right that there's no majority in the House of Commons for a general election at the present time, partly because you need a two-thirds majority under the Fixed-Term Parliament Act. But does he really believe that if the Prime Minister loses by more than 100 votes tomorrow, and potentially 200 votes, that this government has any credibility left at all? If the central plank of their existence, really, fails by so many in the House of Commons, isn't the only honourable thing to do to have a general election and see what the public thinks?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I wouldn't suppose to sort of explain any elements of the Fixed Term Parliament Act to him, given that he legislated it and I didn't. But as well as the two-thirds majority, there is, of course, a vote of no confidence that if within 14 days not passed a second time would automatically lead to a general election. But I take the point, actually, that says that on the issue of the day, on the sum total of 31 months of work and of leadership, if at this point, what we are answering tomorrow, that's it. That's the product of all that work. If that fails, that is a very fundamental failure for a government, and I wouldn't think could be seen off. I think we all ought to be careful, certainly on opposition benches, about setting what we think are good and bad losses. Any loss on this issue is devastating for the government, whatever that number is. So which brings me back to the point that the government will have to come and engage, if they do want to carry on, engage with the opposition, and do so engaging with us actually on the presupposition that we want to engage on the issue, that we actually want to make things better, that we actually might want to find a solution of all of which has been said so far. And we all might, and this would benefit outside as well as inside, perhaps try and change the way in which we engage with each other, because we see from these petitions that we started with, all of they start with asserted facts that aren't necessarily facts. They're just strongly held views, and we all have strongly held views, and are all coming, I presume, and I presume for all honourable members here, from the perspective of what we believe is best for our country. So perhaps we ought to engage with each other on those terms rather than back to sort of what would have fitted to 140 or now 280 characters and just down to those very pure binaries. Because frankly, if we don't show a parliamentary solution in this place, I've talked about the things that perhaps aren't deals for, then where does that leave this issue? And then honourable members who might have really passionately wanted one particular goal might not end up getting it at all. So with that in mind, I'll sit down. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Double.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and it is an honour to follow the honourable member for Nottingham North, and I'd like to congratulate my fellow member of the Petitions Committee, my honourable friend from Sutton-in-Cheam, for the way that he opened this debate on these petitions. The referendum vote was the biggest single democratic exercise in our nation's history. More people voted in that referendum than have voted in any election before. And many people who had never voted before voted. And I have spoken to many people in my constituency who had never voted before, some who had voted many, many years ago and had given up voting because they felt their vote didn't make any difference, who in this referendum voted because they felt this was their opportunity to make their voice heard. This was their opportunity to bring about change. And a clear majority voted to leave. 17.4 million people, as is now well documented, had the courage, despite Project Fear, despite all of the predictions of doom and gloom and the world ending and the economy crashing and 500,000 jobs, had the courage to say, no, we vote for change. They didn't vote for things to be almost the same. They voted because they wanted things to be different. And the responsibility is on us now in Parliament to deliver on that result. And we made it clear to the British public in bringing about this referendum. In fact, the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, famously said that we were putting the decision in the hands of the British people, and we would implement whatever decision they made. This was not a decision to be made by politicians, not a decision to be made by Parliament. This was a decision that the British people would make, and that Parliament would implement what they decided. And that was 2.5, nearly 3 years ago, coming up to 3 years ago now. And here we are at this very important week in Parliament, very significant week in the process of us implementing the decision that the British people made in the referendum. And we have a huge challenge before us. And for me, the challenge is, are we going to do what the British people instructed us to do or not? Because for me, this whole process has now become about far more than simply whether or not we're going to leave the EU. This has become about trust in our democratic process. And we need to understand that there is a growing sense among many, many people in our country, and there are countless emails that I get virtually every day expressing this concern that we are in the middle of an establishment stitch-up that is going to try and prevent us from leaving the EU. That the establishment is going to somehow manufacture a technical outcome that means we don't actually leave. And I have to say that the events of last week and some of the headlines in the newspaper only in the last few days have heightened that very real and genuine concern. And having told the people of this country that we were giving them the decision, giving them the choice, I believe the consequences of us now not delivering on that decision would be incredibly serious for our country. And we are here today to debate a number of petitions regarding our leaving of the EU. As we've already heard, some have called for us to leave immediately, some have called for us to leave a no deal, others are calling for a referendum, and others are basically saying let's scrap the whole thing and pretend it didn't happen. And clearly those petitions reflect the very deep divisions that there are in our country at the moment, that there are strongly and genuinely held views right across the spectrum as to where we are and what should happen next. But it's interesting to note, and I think it's worth noting, that by far the biggest of these petitions, the one that has actually attracted more signatures than all of the others put together, is the one that is, last time I checked, has over 327,000 signatures calling for us to leave on without a deal, without an agreement. And I think that reflects generally what I get in my postbag, that the vast majority of people, particularly those who voted to leave, say on the ballot paper it didn't say leave with a withdrawal agreement, it didn't say leave with a free trade deal, it didn't say leave with any strings attached. It simply said leave or remain, and they voted to leave. And the British people, the majority of them, certainly the vast majority of those who voted leave, simply want us to get on and do what they instructed us to do. And if that means leaving without an agreement, then that is what they want us to do. And I think we need to understand, Mr. Chairman, that that is the legal position. The withdrawal agreement that this House passed stated that the withdrawal bill stated that we will be leaving on the 29th of March this year. It didn't say we will be leaving if we can agree a withdrawal agreement or a future trading deal. It simply says, and established in law, that we will be leaving. And I think we need to understand that there are members of this House who voted for that withdrawal bill who now don't seem to understand that that is what we voted for. There were no strings attached to that decision. It simply says we will be leaving. And I believe that the whole situation of leaving without a deal is not one that I want. I desperately want to have a withdrawal agreement and a future trading arrangement that I can support and I can vote for. Now, very sadly for me, the deal that the Prime Minister has agreed and brought back to this House is not one that I can support, because I do not believe it delivers what we promised we would do in delivering on the referendum result. It locks us into a situation, I believe, that is untenable for our country, that we are locked into a situation that completely undermines our ability to negotiate a future trading arrangement. It locks us into a position where we're having, and this is one of the things I fail to understand, Mr. Hanson, is having spent over 2 years trying to negotiate something when we've had things to negotiate with, how we think, having surrendered those things and already handed those things over, we're going to get a better outcome than we've managed to get in the last 2.5 years. You know, we've had our £39 billion to negotiate with. We've had the ability to walk away and say we will walk away without a deal, and yet we've not made any progress. And what this withdrawal agreement does, it hands those things over to the EU already and then says, let's hope we can get a decent deal out of you. And my view, Mr. Hanson, is that this withdrawal agreement only works if you have faith in two things. The first thing is the goodwill of the EU towards us, and the second thing is the negotiating ability of those negotiating on behalf of the UK. And I'm very sad to say, Mr. Hanson, that the experience of the last 2 years tells me I'd be absolutely foolish to have confidence in those two things, because the way things have gone in the last 2 years show me that those two things are not things that any reasonable person could have confidence in going forward. And so this withdrawal agreement puts us in a position, I believe, where our whole negotiating position is undermined and locks us into a situation that I believe we would be in great danger of never being able to get out of. So regrettably, I'm in a position where I cannot support the deal that is before us. Now, what I hope will happen is that the Prime Minister will go back to the EU, having lost the vote tomorrow. And I personally am of a view that actually, if it is a significant loss, that actually gives a clearer message to the EU that this withdrawal agreement is completely unacceptable to this Parliament, and they have really got to come up with something much, much better, not tinker at the edges or provide us reassurances and nicely worded letters to go alongside it, but fundamentally something far better for our country, or else we will have to leave on no deal. And I really hope, and I know people will say, well, the EU have said time and time again that that is not an option. There is no grounds for renegotiation. Well, as has been said by others in this debate, the EU has actually a very good record of backing down at the last minute when they are up against the wall. And I don't think we've really tested the EU's resolve in these negotiations. And I think losing the vote tomorrow will give the Prime Minister the opportunity to go back and truly test the EU's resolve. Are they really serious that they will not give ground and renegotiate, or are they prepared for us to walk away without a deal? Now, let's be clear that leaving without a deal will have some huge challenges, but I also, let's be clear, it will not be the disaster that some are predicting. I mean, we have heard time and time again the doom merchants say that, you know, we won't have any medicines and our aeroplanes won't be able to fly, and all of the economic predictions that have time and time again been proved wrong. I mean, I find it incredible that people are predicting the impact of Brexit 10 years out, when just about, you know, in my time in politics, just about every prediction of the Treasury from 6 months from now is proved to be wildly wrong. So how they think we can predict 10 years out when they can't get 6-month predictions wrong is utterly beyond me. But every scare story has been completely exposed to be not true. We've even had the Mayor of Calais making clear that there will be no disruption to trucks coming across the Channel from Calais. And so I'm sure, the one thing I'm sure about from our side of things, we're not going to make it more difficult for our exports to leave going the other way either. So I think we can put to bed the scare stories that somehow paint this as an utter disaster. Yes, there will be challenges, but surely our country has shown itself to be at its greatest throughout its history when it's been faced with challenges. And I believe in the ability of the British people. I believe in the ability of British business to overcome any challenges that no deal would put before us as quickly as possible and move on into things for the future. Now, I just want to mention a couple of the other things that these petitions call for, because I think it's worth highlighting a few things. There are petitions calling for a second referendum. And I certainly don't support that. I not only do I think it would be sending a hugely damaging message to the British people in the light of the first referendum, that somehow that was wrong or invalid or whatever, and would be hugely disrespectful to them. But also, I fail to see what it would achieve, because it would be incredibly divisive again. I mean, the first referendum was divisive enough. But I think the second one, in the current climate, would be even more divisive and damaging to our society. But what if the result? What if Leave wins again? What are we going to do? I mean, we've wasted our time. If there is a narrow victory for Remain, what do we have a third one and it's now best of three? I mean, I fail to see what real progress it would make. But one of the things over the weekend when I was thinking about today, I suddenly remembered, in the sort of depths of my memory, that this House did actually consider this matter. On the 20th of December 2017, when we were debating and voting on the withdrawal bill, an amendment was tabled before this House to call for a second referendum on the deal. I don't know how many members here today remember it. But do you know, Mr Hanson, how many members of Parliament voted for that amendment? I was quite astounded. Now, I was thinking it would be hundreds of them listening to some of the voices across the House. It was 23. 23 members of Parliament, when this House had the opportunity to express its view on a second referendum. A whole 23, and good on them, virtually all the Lib Dems did vote for it, so at least they have been consistent. But a whole 23 members of Parliament voted for a second referendum. And that amendment was resoundingly defeated. So I do find it quite difficult to accept that, having had the opportunity to vote for a second referendum only a year ago, that there are so many members of this House now calling for a second referendum. Now, I'm not sure what's gone on in that year, but clearly something has gone on. And my line is quite simple. This House had the opportunity to vote for a second referendum. We resoundingly defeated that amendment, and we should put that to bed. And I think to continue to call for that, having not voted for it at that time ago, does lack credibility. And then there are the petitions saying that we should rescind Article 50, we should scrap the whole thing, let's just cancel Brexit and put it in the too difficult to do pile. And that, I believe, above anything, would be hugely damaging to our democracy. It would be sending a hugely disrespectful message to the British people, having told them, this Parliament, having voted for the referendum by a huge majority, and having said, we put this decision in the hands of the British people, to now say that we can't deliver it, it's too difficult for us to do, let's just scrap it and call the whole thing off, I think would send a very wrong and damaging message to our country. And so I believe that it is absolutely essential that we deliver on the referendum. And I am concerned with some of the things that have been said, and I have to say by colleagues on my side of the House as well, who are clearly scheming and trying to find some unconstitutional technical way to overturn this and prevent Brexit from happening. And I think we need to be honest with the British people. We need to have integrity. And having all of us, certainly in my party, stood on a very clear manifesto commitment in the last election that we would honour the referendum and we would deliver Brexit, to now go back on that and try and prevent it from happening, I believe would be hugely damaging and send all the wrong messages. And so I find myself in a position where I genuinely hope that when it looks like this vote is lost tomorrow night, the Prime Minister does go and try to get a better deal that we can support. That is what I want her to do. That is what I want to be able to see, is her come back with something that I can support. But let's not forget that the legal position that this House voted for is that, come what may, deal or no deal, withdrawal agreement or no withdrawal agreement, we will be leaving the European Union on the 29th of March. And I believe it's absolutely vital that this House delivers on that commitment.
And Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. I'm pleased to be able to speak and respond to the many petitions on the future of Brexit which have been submitted for our consideration today. My own Mansfield constituency was 71% in favour of leaving the EU in the referendum of 2016, and I believe it's still supportive of that decision. In fact, as Parliament is increasingly chaotic and unable to reach consensus, I've felt that determination to leave the EU hardening amongst my residents. Increasingly, correspondence from constituents makes the point that they voted to leave, and that one way or another, with a deal, without a deal, that decision must be respected come the 29th of March. The constituents who have signed the petition we're discussing today, the petitions have equally made their views clear. In my constituency, just short of 1,000 people from Mansfield and Warsop have signed the petitions in support of a clean Brexit on world trade terms, whilst only 150 have signed the petitions in favour of a second referendum or stopping Brexit. Nationally, by far the biggest petition, as has been touched upon, is the one that says leave on world trade terms. And contrary to the narrative we often hear, if anything, I could argue that numbers in my constituency have shifted more in favour of leave since 2016, and my own anecdotal experience is certainly that those attitudes have hardened. The truth is, we argue in this place about precisely what leave meant on the ballot paper. It didn't have caveats. It said remain or leave, not leave subject to the EU being willing to grant us a deal, simply leave, one way or another. And Parliament voted to have a referendum. The result was to leave. Parliament voted to trigger Article 50 and start the leaving process. Parliament voted for the withdrawal bill, which set the date of our leaving in stone, March the 29th. It did not specify we must have a deal in order to leave, simply that we must leave. And that remains the default legal position. It's no surprise that so many have signed the petitions to show their strong feeling that this has already been decided and this House should respect it. What politicians should be debating is not whether or not we leave, whether we have another vote, even if we should stay in the European Union. The only question on the table is about how we leave. There can be no question of us going back now on what both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party promised in their 2017 manifestos. Both promised to leave the European Union and respect the results. The member from Nottingham North mentioned our TV appearance before Christmas. He was wearing a very snazzy Christmas jumper, if I remember rightly. And we had a good debate, as we often do. I struggle with this position and those who say no to the deal, but also no to no deal. And I wonder, in the scenario where the European Union are clear that this might be the only deal on the table, what else is left that respects the result? We have to decide how we leave, and the deal that's on the table, the one we're going to be asked to vote for tomorrow, unfortunately, isn't good enough. It requires us to be part of a customs union. That means we continue to be bound by EU rules and regulations, rules over which we no longer have a say. That's not taking back control. That's worse than being in. As my honourable friend, for instance, Austell Anuki rightly said, you can't deliver on a vote for change by sticking as closely as possible to the status quo. If we can't come to an agreement on a future arrangement, and it seems quite likely, given how the last 2 years have gone, that we're not going to be able to come to an agreement, we'll be tied into a backstop that makes that customs union permanent, that we cannot leave without the European Union permission. And that same customs union arrangement is only for Great Britain, with different rules in place for Northern Ireland. That puts our union under threat, allows the Scottish nationalists to further stir the pot and seek yet more referenda until they get the answers that they want. It breaks the promise that the Prime Minister made to the people of Northern Ireland. The withdrawal agreement we're presented with doesn't fulfil the promises in the Conservative manifesto, and it's simply not acceptable. And that, I feel, is why so many of my constituents signed petitions in favour of no deal. I think in this House we all know, or we can pretty much guess, that the withdrawal agreement is not going to pass in the House of Commons tomorrow. Some in the media suggest a losing margin of 200 or more. I suggest perhaps not as big as that once we've gone through the confusing process of lots of amendments that are likely to make tomorrow very difficult for people out there in the real world to follow. In fact, there are scenarios wherein the government could vote against the withdrawal agreement at the end of the day if it's amended in a way they're not happy with. But one way or another, what that means is the most important question now, and has always been, what happens next? It's not about tomorrow, it's about what is plan B. I want a deal that works. It seems that none is forthcoming, and if that's the case, I agree with my constituents. They voted to leave, they expect us to leave, and at no point has that been subject to us getting a deal. Though the media, many in this building, like to talk about no deal, the truth is leaving on World Trade terms is actually not no deal at all. It's hundreds of deals and transitional arrangements, both in cooperation with the EU and independently, to make sure it can be done as smoothly as possible. Nobody wants chaos, and we will continue to work together to make sure that's not the case. So that's why so many constituents have supported a petition, because they see through Project Fear and they see the benefits of our independent Britain going into the future, whether it's on World Trade terms, no deal, whatever you want to call it. There are a number of benefits to World Trade terms that we should relish, not least being a sovereign nation, again, fully in control of our own affairs, but also able to keep some of that cash too. The withdrawal agreement promises $39 billion for a non-binding wish list of what we might like in a future relationship. I'm a firm believer we should pay our way, and that if we've signed up to projects, if there are things we want to continue to be involved in the future, then we should honour that. However, of the $39 billion, only about 18 is for things like that. Much of the rest is for things like EU commissioners' pensions going into the future, for example, something that we need not contribute if we are not members. And as has been touched upon before, we've had that in our pocket to use in this negotiation, and we haven't utilised that leverage, which we would give away if we signed this withdrawal agreement. A significant proportion of that money could be saved and spent on our priorities in the UK. The clean break draws the end to all of this uncertainty. Everyone who's spoken here has talked about the problems and the challenges of addressing this in Parliament when there is no consensus, and that everybody has a strongly held view for all of the right reasons, absolutely. But that is the only way to draw a line and move on. Everyone knows where we stand, the debate is done, we can focus on the things that genuinely affect the everyday lives of citizens in this country. There's so much more we need to deal with that has been lost in this Brexit melee, and that the best thing for Britain is to move on. It also allows us the freedom to make trade deals of our own, in contrast with the withdrawal agreement that the US, New Zealand, Australia have suggested would make that very difficult. The government's already looking at how we transfer across existing deals from the EU, Switzerland, for example, in order to provide continuity to ensure that we're trading on better than world trade terms with many advanced economies. And actually, we need never trade on world trade terms with Europe either. Article 24 of the World Trade Organization Treaty allows us to continue trading with Europe on zero tariffs while we negotiate a free trade arrangement. Leaving on these terms is a change, of course. Change is required either way. Whether we have a deal, whether we have the withdrawal agreement or not, things will still have to change. But the scaremongering about the impact has been absolutely ridiculous. People have suggested queues of lorries trying to get into the UK and delaying things like medicines into the country. Well, let's not forget, firstly, we've already had occasions where queues like that have existed at Dover, for example, because of protests in France or whatever it may be. So we can't pretend that EU membership has protected us from those challenges. But don't forget that it's us, the UK, that controls who enters our country, and therefore it's us that decides what checks are needed, not Europe. If we don't want to stop goods coming in, we decide not to stop them coming in. The HMRC and DEFRA say no additional checks will be needed, and anyway, most physical checks are done away from the border at source or at destination. We have the ability and the flexibility to make changes and make it work. And equally, the authorities at Calais say they have every intention of prioritising the continued flow of goods at their port too. There isn't time in this debate to go through all the details, but I'd recommend members to read the many works on the subject by Lord Lilly in particular that lay out the facts on world trade terms in great detail. The important point to make is that this is not Armageddon. I sat last night watching Bird Box on Netflix with my wife, and where stranger voices kind of sweep in on the wind and make people kill themselves, and I wondered whether it might be a documentary on the impact of no-deal Brexit funded by Lord Adonis or Alistair Campbell or somebody along those lines. It's not too dissimilar to some of the scare stories that we've heard. We've heard super gonorrhea is going to come flying in from Europe and take us all. We've heard that babies will die because of milk shortages. We've heard that cancer patients will die if we're not in Euratom, when in fact Euratom doesn't even cover medicines at all. It's been absolutely unbelievable, the level of scaremongering on this subject. And the fact is, it's got so ridiculous that most people simply don't believe it. They discount it, and it serves only to harden the attitude that we should leave regardless. And many people have a vested interest in whipping up that fear, but we have to deal with practical realities. We can put in place measures to make leaving with no deal, which in fact requires lots of deals, to work for the UK. The preparations for that should have started earlier, absolutely, but now they're well underway. The second referendum, or revoking Article 50, as is called for in some of the positions we talk about today, would be an absolute betrayal of the trust we put in the citizens of this country to decide on this issue, and I will never support those options. As my honourable friend from Sutton and Team said in his opening remarks, world trade terms is not my first position. I want a deal that I can support, that is the best option for the UK, but in the absence of a good deal, we still have to leave. If the Prime Minister comes back next week to say she intends now, after the withdrawal agreement has failed, to pursue a looser free trade relationship with the EU, to go back and try and negotiate something better in all of our interests, and that in the absence of that, world trade terms could be the backup. But first, let's go and try and find something better. Then I absolutely support her in that. I will give way.
Would my honourable friend, I'm grateful for giving way, would my honourable friend agree with me that if the vote should be lost and we are moving closer towards WTO terms and no-deal terms, whatever you want to call it, that we must move from contingency planning, which is really important, to actually starting to negotiate and sign bilateral agreements, that two-way thing, to alleviate some of the turbulence that we've discussed.
Absolutely. I think if that intervention is absolutely right, that we need to put in place everything we can to make this work for the United Kingdom. That needs to move from talking about things we might need to do and having those contingency arrangements to getting things signed and sealed on paper so that we can move forward one way or the other in the future. But as I say, if the Prime Minister wants to go back to Europe with a stronger hand, having seen exactly how much feeling there is against the nature of this withdrawal agreement in the Houses of Parliament, and to say and give the European Union one last chance to come with something that we can all get behind and support for the benefit of both the UK and the European Union, then I absolutely would support her in that, and I hope that's what she will do next week. But one way or another, we have to leave. Britain can thrive outside of the European Union. No deal is very much better than the bad deal that is on offer. And my constituents increasingly, I feel, and increasingly represented in the correspondence that I receive, are absolutely adamant that this place must support us leaving on the 29th of March, one way or the other.
Shepherd. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, and a pleasure for the first time, I think, to serve under your chairpersonship. I want to make 2 points before getting on to the debate about the manner in which we're discussing this. The first is that a great many people have taken the time and trouble to read and to sign these petitions of various kinds. And this Parliament has previously said that it is very respectful and supportive of the process of people petitioning this institution. And yet we are in a situation where today, on a topic which has gripped the country in what can only be regarded as a political crisis that has no end in sight at the moment, we have 9 members of Parliament who turned up to receive the petitions. Now, I know the reason why that is so. I know because the main event is still happening only 100 metres away. But I have to say, Chair, this is not the first time that this has happened. I remember before Christmas a very similar occasion when I was here to respond from the third party to a petition about Brexit whilst a big Brexit discussion was going on in the Chamber. And I don't say this to criticise, I'm merely raising the observation, and I want to say as gently as possible to the Petitions Committee, to the Speaker's panel, and to the clerks of the House, that we know this is not a topic that's going to go away. It will dominate our politics at least throughout the next year. We know that Parliament sits at 2:30 on a Monday, and we know that after a weekend of it not sitting, there are likely to be statements, and if anything is likely, if there's likely to be a significant event in this debate, it's likely to happen on a Monday afternoon. So if we are in a situation in the months to come of receiving further petitions relating to Brexit, I would ask that we don't schedule them on a Monday afternoon, and that the committee, and I will take an intervention, but I'm really trying not to be divisive or critical. I'm simply asking the committee to at least give consideration to a different schedule.
I just wanted to, as a matter of explanation, the 4:30 on a Monday afternoon is the slot that's allocated every week. So it's not, there's not a lot of scope in terms of just that sort of level of flexibility doing that. And actually, although we meet in private, one of the discussions that we often have with Brexit petitions is because we're debating them so often in the House, are we just duplicating debate? We try and give people a voice as much as we can, but I take your point.
I understand that. I mean, the same is true of the Backbench Committee, that has no control over when it can actually schedule a debate. It has to work within times that are given to it. But I'm raising this in order that the Petition Committee might consider it and make representations to whoever is in control of the schedule to point out the problems that we are having. Because I think, you know, we can make jokes about it and all the rest of it, but I think there will come a point that if this continues, the public are going to say, well, are these petitions really being taken seriously, or seriously enough by members of Parliament? The second point I'd make, and it's not a major point, but I'm not sure about the efficacy of lumping all of the petitions together in a 1 or 4 consideration, to be honest. And I know it would take more time if we weren't to do that. But, you know, whilst the petitions appear to be alternatives to each other, it's not necessarily the case that you can test the pros and cons for each by reference to the people who are petitioned on a completely different matter. So I would have thought we probably in the future ought not to look at aggregating these matters and simply making the assumption that anybody who wants to sign a petition about Brexit is going to be happy and content about their concerns being considered in conjunction with anybody else who wants to sign a petition about Brexit, even though it might be from a completely different perspective. Now, having said that, I'd like to move on to the substance of the debate. I'm against Brexit. My party's against Brexit. Scotland voted against Brexit, so I think people know where I stand. And I say in response to the debate, I'm not into Project Fear. I had enough of Project Fear in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. I don't suggest the world will end if Brexit goes ahead on the 29th of March. In fact, I don't even think that it will be, you know, that big a historical event apart from the significance of the date in terms of what materially happens. In fact, the most horrible thing, I think, about this process is that what we will do is we will enter into a process of a slow, insidious grinding down of living standards and with that will come a grinding down of the hope and optimism of the country and a fueling of many of the sentiments which led to the vote in 2016 in the first place. So that is my concern, that we are about to commit a degree of national self-harm that we could avoid. It's entirely self-afflicted. Now, having said that, from the petitions that are before us today, I think all that we can summate is that opinion is divided. So the big question now is, what are we going to do about it in order to take this process forward, knowing that the country is divided, knowing that Parliament is divided, and it is very, very difficult to try and chart a course through. So I want to turn to the question of whether or not there should be another referendum on the question. I don't think we should put the same question again, but I do think that there are circumstances in which it is legitimate to go back to the people and consult them further. I don't think you can do that every day, but I think in a democracy, people have got the right to change their minds, and particularly where one decision has created a process and led to things that weren't anticipated, people have the right to be consulted again. Now you, oh, I didn't realise you were there. Of course I do.
The Honourable Gentleman referred to optimism. The optimism of 17.4 million people who voted to leave cannot be ignored either. And I respect the Honourable Gentleman very much for his comments. We've probably many things we disagree on, and we probably disagree on this issue as well. But I think, does he not agree that if there's a second referendum, that will, and by its very nature, be divisive, and that unfortunately what it does is engineer more disquiet and anger amongst the people, and ignores totally the referendum of June 2016, when 17.4 million people says, we want to leave. Let's honour that.
The Honourable Gentleman has preempted me. I'm coming on to precisely those points, so bear with me. In my view, you can't, in a democracy, people have the right to change their mind, but on the other hand, you can't provide procedures for people to change their mind every day, every week, every month, or even every year. But there are circumstances in which it is legitimate to revisit the question. So I would set three tests of those. The first is, has the information on which the original decision was made changed significantly from when it was made? And I think in this case it has. Even if to say there's far more information available than there was 3 years ago, but certainly some of the promises that were made 3 years ago appear, even by those who proposed them, not to be able to be delivered. Secondly, have people changed their mind on the subject by an extent significant enough to suggest that the result would be different were the question asked again? And thirdly, has the legislator, the Parliament, which is charged with the responsibility of executing the decision of a referendum, has it proved unwilling or unable to do so? Now, in my contention, the first two of those tests have been met, and the third will be met tomorrow night, when the government's proposal crashes and burns.
Listening carefully to what he's saying, I'm just very interested on the second point, that people change their mind. What does he base that on? Because if it's opinion polls, we all know opinion polls in the last few years have been so wrong. Even the opinion polls on the referendum predicted a win for Remain and proved to be wrong. So surely we can't trust opinion polls as evidence that people have changed their mind.
I don't know about trusting opinion polls, but it's clearly evidence. I mean, it is evidence that people have changed their mind. And pretty much, the aggregate now of opinion polls suggests that, yes, 17.4 million people did vote 3 years ago in a certain position, but a significant number of them have now changed their minds. Now, we have ignored up to now the 48% who didn't go along with this proposition, and I believe we are in danger now of not only continuing to ignore them, but of denying the possibility that people might have changed their minds and ignoring the fact that they have done so. And, I will, but I'm anxious not to labour it overly long, but I'll give way one more time.
I just want to say, when I talk to about constituency, my constituency voted 56-44% to leave. And I can tell you this, over the holiday period where I made it my business to talk to numerous people wherever they may have been in my constituency, in fishermen, and farming, and business, and ordinary life, and the opinion is hardening in relation to leaving the EU. That's what's happening in my constituency. I'm sure that's happening in other constituencies as well.
I have no reason to gainsay what the Honourable Gentleman says about his constituency, but likewise in my constituency, The direction is the other way. In fact, the current polling in Scotland suggests that whilst 62% of people voted to remain 3 years ago, if the vote were to be held today, it would probably be over 70% of the people. So, you can play that either way. The point is that opinion not only is fundamentally divided, but there is a churn in public opinion, and people are anxious to discuss and be consulted on the matter again. And I do think some of the arguments that have been put against this are really quite disturbing. There's been this suggestion over the weekend, for example, with the Prime Minister saying that, it's ridiculous for people to ask for a second vote. Imagine what would happen if the UK Parliament overturned a referendum result in Wales or in Scotland. People will be outraged about it. Well, of course, it was quickly pointed out that the Prime Minister herself voted in this Parliament to overturn the referendum result in Wales, but my concern is with regard to Scotland. It's a false comparison, because the vote in Scotland in 2014 was to secede from the United Kingdom. So the comparison of saying what would happen if the United Kingdom Parliament were to overturn the vote of the Scottish electorate, that's no comparison at all. What would be the comparison is to say, well, what would it be like if people had voted in a UK-wide referendum to leave the EU and the European Union then decided that they couldn't do so? That's the comparison. And no one would suggest that is in any way legitimate. Well, the Honourable Gentleman can laugh, but no one is surely suggesting that the European Union is either trying to or has the legal ability to prevent the United Kingdom leaving the European Union.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman giving way, and clearly they have no legal right. But I'm sure he would agree that they are making it as difficult as possible and trying every trick in the book to make it as hard as possible for us to leave, partly because, as the Honourable Gentleman for Blakely said earlier, that they want to set an example of us to make sure that no one else dares vote to leave.
The Honourable Gentleman says they have absolutely no right to do that, and they may be concerned about agreeing to certain things in terms of the nature of the United Kingdom withdrawing, but they have no right to prevent the United Kingdom withdrawing whatsoever, and to suggest that they do, I think, is disingenuous. But I'm slightly concerned about another thing as well, which is that people have talked, and they've talked here today, about Parliament overturning the will of the people. I mean, please consider this language, because I don't think this is particularly helpful. No one is suggesting that this Parliament should vote to disregard and overturn the result of the referendum that was taken in 2016. Well, the Minister chunters at me from a sedentary position, but maybe I can't say no one. I'm not suggesting that. My party is not suggesting that. I have not heard in this chamber anyone suggest that Parliament should vote to overturn the decision of the 2014 referendum. What people are arguing about is whether the people who took the decision to leave the European Union should be consulted on whether, now knowing what they do, they wish to continue that decision. And that brings me to what the question would be on the ballot paper, because there's been some discussion about this as well. As I see it, and I'm trying just to be logical, in June 2016, the people of the United Kingdom voted to start a process. They said, this is the direction we want to go in. We want to leave the European Union, and they want the government to go ahead and do this. And the government of the day, and I have many criticisms about how they did this, but I cannot claim that they didn't engage in this and commit resources and time to try and discharge that mandate. The government has got to a position 2.5 years later with a deal on the table as to, let's not even call it a deal, quite right, don't call it a deal, with a set of proposals as to how that mandate from 2016 could be implemented, how it should be discharged and executed. So now the question is, are those proposals acceptable to the people who commissioned that process in the first place? Is this really what they want to do? And they should be given a choice whether to go ahead with it or to call a stop and a halt to the process in the first place, which means that the status quo ante would pertain and we would remain in the European Union. So those, to me, are the two broad choices. I think it is, I'll take the intervention, because I think I can guess what he's going to say.
Thank you very much for that. Does he not see the problem in presenting a deal that a petition of 300,000 people say is not Brexit, and that those of us who've sat on this side of the chamber today have said does not represent Brexit, as Brexit on a ballot paper, doesn't give anybody any educated choice as to what they're voting on.
But it is Brexit. Right? I mean, it may not be the type of Brexit the Honourable Gentleman wants. It may not be as hard and as quick as the Honourable Gentleman wants, but it is the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. The Minister will maybe confirm that when he makes a statement. I'm pretty sure that what we're voting on tomorrow night is a form of Brexit. And that my point is that after 2.5 years of intense discussion, argument, negotiation, research, discussion, they've got to a position where the government says this is the best they can come up with. Now, I think it's pretty shoddy and I shall be voting against it, but I don't dispute the fact that it probably is the best the government can come up with. So that's it. The people who wanted this to happen, that is what it looks like. Do you want it to happen or do you not? That is the question that people should be given. Now, people have talked and said that, well, it's impossible to do that by the 29th of March. Well, of course it is. Everyone accepts it's impossible to have another referendum by the 29th of March, which is why the obvious decision for Parliament to take would be to say, we want to go back and consult the people, and we wish the European Union to allow an extension of the Article 50 process in order to allow that to happen. And I cannot conceive of a situation where the European Union would say in those circumstances that it would not consent to a 3-6-month extension of Article 50, however long it would take, to organise this plebiscite and to ask people, are they really sure that they want to go ahead with that? The European Union has said it would not countenance an extension of Article 50 if nothing changed, if the proposal wasn't changed. But in this instance, the whole purpose of seeking the extension is to change, or at least to offer the possibility of changing the proposition in the first place. And I cannot believe that the European Union would deny the United Kingdom the opportunity to do that. In fact, if it did, I think I would call foul on behalf of the European Union. And I might even change my mind in what our relationship would be. So convinced am I that they would not take this position. I do think that some of the language that's been used in this debate is potentially very dangerous indeed. People have suggested, for example, we can't possibly allow people to vote again on this because this would, if the result goes a different way, then it's going to, not just be divisive, but that the people who lose are going to be, they may be looking to go on the streets. There may be political violence. It may lead to an increase in the far right in this country and to going back to scenes that we saw in the 1970s when I first came into politics. But I think that only happens if you tell people that what is happening is a process of them being excluded from making a decision. If we make it clear that the reason why there would be a people's vote or another referendum is to include people and make sure that all of them are involved in the decision, I don't see why that should happen. In fact, and if it does happen, I think it would be an illegitimate response to any decision that might be taken. Now, I'm assuming that a people's vote, of course, might lead to a change in position, but it might not. In which case, isn't it better that going ahead with this process, with the potential difficulty that it involves, that people get the chance to make absolutely sure that that is what they want to do? I really think it is. And if I could just turn, I don't want to go on too much longer, but just to say, in terms of the position of the Labour Party, I don't want the Shadow Minister perhaps to clarify this for us, because I understand, and several Labour members have said, that their position is that there should be a general election. Now, we're not going to get a two-thirds majority, but the obvious route to a general election is to place a motion of no confidence in the government. So I would ask the Shadow Minister, when or in what circumstances is that going to happen? Will it happen when the government is defeated tomorrow night? Will it happen after you've given the government another 3 days to come back with Plan B, which of course is something we decided last week? Or will it never happen unless you're convinced that you know the outcome of the result because you don't want to put it and be defeated? I really think people, in as much as we need to get over tomorrow night's decision before we can move forward, we also need to get over the no confidence question before Parliament and the country can move forward as well. But I also say this. The leader of the Labour Party seems to have been hardening his position in recent days and saying that were there to be a general election, then it would be his intention to put in the Labour manifesto a commitment to implement the result of the 2016 European Union referendum. In other words, to proceed with Brexit. Perhaps the Shadow Minister could clarify if indeed that is the case, because it seems to me you would then be in a position of calling a general election on the question of Brexit, but not offering people the alternative or the option of stopping Brexit. And I think that would lead to political delusionment on a scale far greater than another people's vote would do. So it would be helpful to have some clarification, because a choice between, the Prime Minister's Brexit or the Leader of the Opposition's Brexit isn't really a choice at all, as far as I'm concerned. And, Mr Davis, let me just finish by reference to the situation in Scotland, because we have been trying very, very hard to play a constructive role in this debate. As I say, we have our mandate. 74% of my constituents told me they didn't want to leave the European Union. That figure probably closer to 80. 97% of the thousands of people who write to me in this are against going ahead with Brexit. So I'm quite clear, but I'm not standing here saying, stop it now. We have, in fact, for 2.5 years tried to engage in this Parliament. The Scottish Government has put forward compromise proposals, but they have been rejected time and time again, because the manner in which this has gone about has been an object lesson in how not to do politics. Now, the Prime Minister last week had a meeting with backbench LPs, cross-party meeting, which I attended. And as the member for Leeds Central pointed out, it was a welcome event. Just a shame that it hadn't been done 2.5 years ago when the vote was initially taken. And it really was a question, I think, of too little too late. But in the event of a defeat tomorrow night, I would ask the Minister to clarify whether the government, given that it is no longer able to get its own position through the House, whether it will then consider working on a cross-party basis and consulting with members of different views and from different parties in order to see if it is possible to get a consensual and agreed way forward. Because I tell you this, much as Scotland is involved at the minute in trying to stop Brexit, in order to get a situation where the UK doesn't leave the EU, we're doing that because it's in the interest of the people that we represent, as well as we believe in the interest of the people of all of the UK. But if our voices continue to be ignored, then we do have an alternative, and it will be activated once this Brexit dust settles.
Thank you. On behalf of the Labour Party, Paul Bloomfield.
Thank you, Mr Davis, and it is a pleasure to wind up the debate for the opposition with you in the chair. I'm sure you will deeply regret having missed many of the contributions during the earlier debate, knowing your own views on these matters. I'd like to thank also the Honourable Member for Sutton and Cheam for the way in which he opened the debate, drawing on the contributions made from petitioners on both sides of the argument and around different proposals, and the way in which he shared some of the complexity of the issues that we are facing. But also, in that context, draw attention to the points made by my honourable friend, the member for Nottingham North, that the tone in which we try to have these discussions is so very important, particularly after some of the stuff we saw around the precincts of Westminster over the last week. And he's right also to say that we are at a crossroads, but that at that point, people expressing wildly diverse views are all doing so because they are sincerely held, as indeed were those reasons that people voted however they did in the referendum in 2016, and we should respect all those views too. Now, the petitions we've debated today do reflect the divisions in the country, and indeed in Parliament as well. Divisions that have been exacerbated and not healed by the way in which this government has approached the negotiations over the last 2 years. And it didn't have to be like this. Now, when the negotiations began, we urged the Prime Minister to look beyond the war in her own party and to reach out to the majority in Parliament and across the country who respected the fact that the people had voted to leave, and on that the Honourable Member for St Austell and Newquay is right, as is my Honourable friend the Member for Blackley and Broughton. People had voted to leave. But also to accept that they had done so by a painfully close margin. We urge the Prime Minister to recognise the vote for what it was, a mandate to end our membership of the European Union, but not a mandate to rupture our relationship with our closest neighbours, our key allies, and our most important trading partner, and certainly not to crash out of the European Union without any agreement. Now, the honourable members for Mansfield and Morley and Outwood have both made the point, in disagreeing with it, that this was the only deal that would be countenanced by the European Union, that it was, echoing the words of the Prime Minister, and I'm sure the Minister will make the point, that it was the only deal possible. It was the only deal possible within the constraints that the Prime Minister had set herself. The European Union made it clear that there were a range of options that they were prepared to consider and a range of relationships that they were prepared to consider, but that the British government had effectively ruled those out with the negotiating terms that it had set itself. And we regret the fact that the Prime Minister allowed the agenda to be set by what her own Chancellor describes as, and I quote, the Brexit extremists within her party. She set the red line, she boxed herself in, and she ended up pleasing nobody with this deal, not Leave voters nor Remain voters. And then in December, with the clock ticking, she wasted a further month by delaying the vote on the deal that is doomed to fall tomorrow. And so what's the Prime Minister's strategy now to get the deal through? Threatening MPs and threatening the country with no deal at all. Now, we've made it clear from the start that we would not accept a blackmail Brexit, the choice of my deal or no deal, and we will reject her deal tomorrow, confident that Parliament will not allow the country to leave without a deal. And that's the clearly expressed view of the majority of members of Parliament. Because, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer has made clear, leaving without a deal would be, and again I quote, a terrible outcome for the UK economy. He compared it with the dark days of the 1980s. And it's not enough to talk about the car industry bleating or to talk about doom merchants. And I'd say to the honourable member, when we talk about stockpiling medicines, this was not scare stories run by doom merchants. These were the proposals made by the government in the preparatory papers that those supporting Brexit had urged them to prepare in order to ensure the country was ready for no deal. It's the government's proposals that we need to stockpile medicines and stockpile food. It's the government who said that they can't continue to guarantee power supply in Northern Ireland. That's their assessment of the position in relation to no deal. And we should recognise that the voices warning against no deal don't just simply come from within this place or from partisans within this place in the debate. They come from the CBI, from the Engineering Employers Federation, from the British Chamber of Commerce, and indeed from the TUC, those who are at the coalface of the consequences if we do in fact leave with no deal. Now, I've heard it said within this debate that if we should leave without a deal, and it's a strong argument made by many of its advocates, and reclaim the 39 million that we are handing to the EU. Now, many of the people that make that argument also make the argument that we should be striking out to secure new trade deals with many other countries around the world. The Chancellor's right when he makes the point that what country is going to sign up to a deal with another country which has demonstrated its ability to renege on properly made agreements and on the good faith within which they were made. I will indeed.
We agree on tomorrow's vote. We disagree on the objectives, and I assume we agree that we all should follow the law. Does my honourable friend not accept the view of the House of Lords Committee on this matter about where our legal obligations started and finished on this? And we do not have a legal obligation to pay £39 billion. And the basis of trade deals is to follow the rules and the law on these matters.
Well, I obviously agree with my honourable friend that we should follow the law. There'd be much purpose in this place if we didn't accept that premise. But the House of Lords Committee expressed an opinion. There are different opinions, and I probably accept that not all of that £39 billion there are different views, and the member from Mansfield differentiated by some of it. But to renege, as some of the to suggest that we should renege, some of the Brexit extremists do, on the entire £39 billion would lead us into a position where we would be in contravention of agreements. I will.
Very grateful to him for keeping away. And would he agree that, in the EU's own words, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed? And on that basis, we have not actually yet agreed to the £39 billion, and therefore we're not reneging on anything if we can't come to an agreement with the EU.
Well, he will know that it was the former, but one, Brexit secretary, himself an opponent of the Prime Minister's deal, who agreed to the sequencing of the decisions and who signed up to the £39 billion question. So, but let me move on to another aspect of the no deal argument, and it's important because those who advocate it have said, well, if we leave with no deal, it's easy. We're just going to slip out on WTO terms. No problem at all. And I'd highlight the point made by my honourable friend, the member from Nottingham North, and it was echoed by the honourable member for Sutton Cheam in his opening remarks, that WTO terms only cover a part of our relationship. And they don't, for example, cover the critical relationships over security and the protection of this country in crime and in fighting terrorism. But even if we look at the issue in relation to our trading relationship, there's a suggestion given here that you just slip into WTO terms easily, seamlessly, without process, and that those terms are the default position for every member of the WTO. But there is not a member of the WTO that doesn't have additional trade agreements above and beyond those terms. And our agreements currently, with something like 70 countries, are through our membership of the European Union. It's negotiated them bilaterally, and it's worth noting, for example, when the government talked in their white paper some time ago about our expanding markets around the world, they cited South Korea as an example, and they were right to. Huge developments in UK trade with South Korea since the EU signed a bilateral trade deal with South Korea. And those arguing for this easy process have suggested that it will be simple to roll over those agreements in the brave new world. But they have already had to confront the harsh truth that some 20 countries, including those allies who they point to so regularly, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, have objected to us simply rolling into those agreements over because they see the opportunity to gain commercial advantage. I don't blame them. We'd probably do the same in a different situation. So that process of simply slipping into the WTO in the way that's been suggested, it bears no relation to the real situation. Now, I understand why the idea of no deal has gained popularity. It's partly because it's a very simple and straightforward proposition, but it's partly, and very significantly, the fault of the Prime Minister herself. She launched the meaningless mantra of no deal is better than a bad deal way back January 2017 at Lancaster House, and she and members of the government have been repeating it endlessly. It's no wonder that people think that no deal is a viable option. And she justified it by saying, and I quote, "We would be able to trade with Europe, we would be free to strike trade deals across the world." But she failed to make clear that no deal does not mean the status quo. In that sense, it's not like, I think the former Brexit Secretary compared it with buying a house. You're in negotiations and the deal breaks down and you walk away. Well, yes, you walk away, but you walk away with no less advantage than you entered the negotiations. Walking away on no deal in this context means substantially damaging your own position. Yes, it would mean in theory that we have the ability to trade with the EU, but not on the same terms as we currently do. The terms of seamless trade that countless supply chains and just-in-time production rely on would disappear. Back then, Mr. Davis, in terms of our trade relationship with Europe, she was happy to suggest that nothing would change. But the truth's now out, and the Prime Minister has turned her own slogan on its head, because she's now desperately going around the country and within Parliament saying that we have to accept her own doomed deal because the alternative is no deal. And obviously she says no deal would be a disaster, and on that she is at least right. But the country deserves better than the choice between shrinking the economy by 4% under her deal and 8% under no deal. Mr. Davis, we're in clearly unprecedented times, and I would say to the Honourable Member St Austell and Newquay, he made the comment that the EU have tried to frustrate, the EU27 has tried to frustrate the process. I think what has frustrated this process more than anything has been the inability of the government to agree its own position. I've spent some time talking with politicians from across the political spectrum and across the nations within the EU27, and time and again they've said, look, we're sorry that the UK has chosen to leave the European Union, we wish you weren't, but we recognise you are. We would simply like to be able to negotiate with some certainty, knowing what your country wants, and knowing that once it's agreed, your Prime Minister is able to deliver it, even within the framework of her own party. And it's the war within that party that has held back the negotiations more than any other factor. So we are now pretty clear that the deal will be defeated tomorrow, but then what? Well, the House has made it clear against the government's opposition that the Prime Minister will have to return within 3 days with Plan B and not try to run the clock down any further. And governments that no longer govern, that can no longer govern, don't have a place. That's why we're calling for a general election. And I will come to the Honourable Member for Edinburgh East point. This is the central issue of our time. It's certainly the central issue of this Parliament. The government has spent 2 years focused on this above everything. It has caused a paralysis in other critical areas of economic and social policy. All its energies have been focused on this deal. And so if that deal is defeated tomorrow, the honourable thing, the right thing, and the thing in years gone by would be for that government to step down. Because the Fixed Term Parliament Act, it is indeed, as my honourable friend pointed out, more complex. And we will, therefore, without wasting time, after the deal is defeated, seek to move a vote of no confidence in this government. And if the government runs scared from facing the voters, and I understand why they might after last June.
Tommy Shepherd. So just ask for a little bit more clarity. You say if the deal is rejected, you will at some time. Can you give us an indication as to the front bench thinking in this? Would it be crucially, would you give the government time to present a plan B before you made a decision on no confidence?
Well, I anticipated that intervention, and he'll anticipate my response. I said we would waste no time, and I'm not going to share with him exactly the way that decision will unfold. But I hope that members opposite might actually recognise that it would be the point at which a general election would be a way of resolving the issue. But I recognise that they may not after their experience last June. And so let me say to those who signed the petition on the second referendum, and we've debated similar petitions previously and at much further length, at that point, if there is to be no general election, we will look at all the options available, and that includes a further referendum. And I would say that in that context, I think it is profoundly irresponsible of the Prime Minister to go around the country rallying the people against Parliament, or the Foreign Secretary attacking the Speaker of the House of Commons in the way that he did on Friday, or for the Transport Secretary to say that if the Prime Minister's deal is not accepted, it will lead to a quote, less tolerant society, more nationalistic nation, open to extremist populist political forces. I think their efforts would have been better spent condemning those who are driving intolerance within our politics and presenting a united front against that sort of extremism. Briefings to the Sunday papers about the coup in Parliament is clearly intended to set voters against the MPs, but we should not in this place allow Parliament to be intimidated. Mr. Davis, the truth is that there are no easy choices facing us over the next weeks, and there are probably no good outcomes. We have to make the best of where we are. Those are the difficulties that Parliament is grappling with. We need calm heads, not ramping up the rhetoric, but recognising the consequences of all the choices that we face. And for the opposition, that's what we're committed to doing, and to doing so in the interest of all the people that we represent.
Now, may I invite the Minister, Kwesi Kwarteng, to...
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Now, I said to myself, I think about halfway through this debate, that I would keep my remarks short and brief, because we've had an extensive debate, we've had excellent speeches, and frankly, we've rehearsed many of these points.
You've only got 45 minutes.
I'm fully aware. I'm fully aware, Mr. Davis, of the timescale. You're lucky that, Mr. Davis, that my hour-long speech will have to be curtailed. But I wanted to make brief remarks because many of these points have been rehearsed at length in debates gone by, and I'm sure they will be in the future. I'm very pleased that my honourable friend, the member for Sutton and Cheam, has, on behalf of the Petitions Committee, introduced this debate. He read out the petitions, he read out hundreds of thousands, the views of hundreds of thousands of people, and it was striking, as he himself pointed out, that all of these viewpoints were essentially contradictory. There was a full and wide range of opinion in the country, as evidenced by the petitions, as there is a full and divergent view in this House of Commons. Just here with, 9 MPs, we have a wide range of views. We have people who support Brexit but don't like the deal. We have people who support Brexit but do like the deal. And we have people who don't like the deal and don't like Brexit, and the permutations seem endless. And that's only with 9 MPs. And I think what I wanted to make very clear is that this degree of divergence of view, these very different opinions expressed right across this country show the level of confusion there might well be if this exercise, if this Brexit is not concluded in an orderly fashion. And as you would expect, Mr. Davis, my own view and the view of the government is that the best way of delivering Brexit in a timely, orderly manner is through the deal on the withdrawal agreement. It is not true to say that it doesn't deliver Brexit. I think that's a grotesque exaggeration and caricature of the deal. I thought very hard alongside many MPs, some MPs here, for Brexit in 2016. I was very clear about the three things I wanted to see from Brexit. I wanted to see a drastic curtailment, if not an end to the club membership, the 10 billion net a year that we were paying indefinitely, and we would be paying more as we entered a new budget period. The deal completely prevents that. The deal essentially, there's no 39 billion figure in the agreement. That's a sort of snapshot, if you like, a short-hand expression. It's a lot of money. But it actually equates only to 4 years of net payments. We were in the EU, the EEC, for 46 years. Everyone understands that to leave such a commitment, to leave that union after such a long membership, would take time. And I think the deal recognises that. The deal curtails the length of the implementation period. It curtails the money. 39 billion is often quoted, but that's against 10 billion every single year from today till Kingdom Come. And, importantly, one of the big issues in the Brexit manifesto referendum was freedom of movement from the EU. Many people were saying that, and particularly amongst our ethnic minority communities, were saying, how is it that someone who doesn't speak any English at all from the EU can come into Britain without a job? And yet my relations from Commonwealth countries from outside the EU do not have that opportunity. That was an issue. And amongst many other people, certainly in my constituency, they mentioned freedom of movement. They said, as they were builders, they were people working in construction, and I remember coming out of Staines Station and someone telling me he was going to vote for Brexit because he hadn't had a wage increase for 15 years. Now, clever economists might say that was simplistic, but that was what the view was. That's how people felt life and felt their professional experience was developing. And freedom of movement was a big issue. This withdrawal agreement, and it is a deal, it's an agreement, it's something that we need to vote on, it's not perfect. Like any deal in history, there's some give and take. But the deal, the agreement substantially delivers on an end to freedom of movement. And that is why we are introducing an immigration bill. So that's the second big thing. It delivers on that. The third big issue, as I recall in the campaign, was, of course, the issue about the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ. Would that still continue to be sovereign over this Parliament? Now, the withdrawal agreement, once again, delivers on that. And what I would say is that I think the deal is a good deal. I think it delivers largely on what we campaigned for as Brexiteers. And what I would say to my Brexit colleagues, and I think this is what the Prime Minister, I know this is what the Prime Minister said today in her speech in Stoke, is that there is a very marked and strong current of opinion in the House of Commons that wants to subvert or reverse Brexit. Now, I know those are strong words. I know people are going to say, oh, well, we just want to scrutinise legislation. Forget all that. It's clear to a child that there are MPs in this House who want to reverse the referendum. They've openly said the referendum result was a disaster. They've openly pledged themselves to overturn the referendum result. And the only way they can do that, and they know this, is by means of a second referendum. They don't like a second referendum because they want to test how robust the decision is or to celebrate this exercise in democracy. The way to reversing Brexit is very clear. You have to do it through a second referendum because that would give it the authority that the first referendum had. You simply, not even the most, well, I don't know about our SNP friends and members here, but it would take a very bold Remainer to say that the House of Commons could simply unilaterally disregard the referendum. So if, Mr. Davis, one wants to stay in the EU, one has to accept that the second referendum is the only way that you're going to do that. Now, other members of this House, people on this side, people who represent Leave constituencies, have detected a hardening of opinion, and I, as a member representing a Leave constituency, would concur. I don't actually believe that even if a second referendum were to take place, that the Remainers would get what they wish for. But I fully understand that that's their only shot. That's their only conduit to reversing something which they think is a disaster, and that's the route that they want to pursue. It is the government's view that that would be wholly destructive, it would be divisive, and it would simply be a cheat. It would be an attempt to circumvent the decision that the vast majority of people in this House voted for a referendum, and they agreed, they voted to trigger Article 50. The House has also voted for the Withdrawal Act. It's past that. So let's not be under no illusions. This second referendum debate is simply a means of trying to reverse the result of the first referendum, and that's something which the government simply cannot accept. We want to move forward, and we want to conclude Brexit, and we want to do so in an orderly and managed fashion. I was almost going to say an elegant fashion, but I think that would be pushing things too far. But we have to deliver on the. Yeah, quite happy to give way.
Tommy Shepherd. Just, if the minister's so convinced that he and the Brexiteers, as he called them, would win a second referendum, why is he so scared of letting the people have their say?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to the member for Edinburgh East, whose speech, it was interesting because he gave his speech, and about halfway through I'd realised I'd heard it all before, in the speech before Christmas. Very elegant, very well put, but I have heard all these arguments before. I'm not afraid, I'm not scared of a second referendum. I think I'm just simply trying to focus people's minds on what the second referendum means. The second referendum is being proposed not by great exponents of democracy, not by champions of the people's voice. The second referendum, almost exclusively, is being proposed by people who are on record as having said that the first referendum result was a disaster, they want to reverse it, and they fully accept that the only way that they can get their cherished view of staying within the EU is by a second referendum. And on that basis, I reject that. I think it's trying to subvert the result of the 2016 referendum. We can pretend that it's a wonderful exercise in democracy, but it isn't. It's trying to go against a clear vote, a clear, decisive vote of the people in 2016. And the honourable member for Edinburgh East also pointed out, oh, the opinion polls have changed. They haven't changed that much. And those were the very opinion polls, as the honourable member for St Austell and Newquay suggested, those were the very opinion polls that said Remain would win by 10 points, as I recall, the day before the referendum in 2016. They're the very opinion polls that got things consistently wrong through that whole referendum campaign. So I don't believe that his second premise that somehow there's been a marked shift in public opinion should precipitate a referendum. Now, I think that this is an extensive debate. I'm sure members of this House... Yeah, quite happy to give way.
To the honourable gentleman, and I agree completely with the point. I agree completely with the point he's making about the motivation for a second referendum. But some of the people who want to subvert the 2016 referendum result have another string to their bow, and that is attrition, to extend the process until the House or the public get weary of it by extending Article 50. Can the Minister give this meeting an assurance that under no circumstances will the government introduce a statutory instrument which will change the date in the European Withdrawal Act for leaving the European Union?
Minister.
The honourable member is quite right, I think, to raise this as an issue. My understanding is that the government will not seek to extend Article 50. That is the government's view. But in the light of what happened last week, when we are hearing stories about the House or potentially a motion of the House overturning Standing Order number 14, it may well be that the House of Commons, as a collective, will take a view, as the honourable member for Sheffield Central, the Shadow Minister suggested. He said, I quote him loosely perhaps, but he said something to the effect, the House will not countenance no deal. And what that means is that the House of Commons will take it upon itself, essentially to perhaps introduce legislation or a motion binding or strongly encouraging the government to extend Article 50. Now, I know what the government's position is, but given what happened last week, which was extraordinary to me, that the amendment was made, it was allowed to be made, who knows what will happen? And I think the Prime Minister is quite right to suggest, because I think it's a statement of fact, that Brexit itself is in danger. If the House votes down the deal tomorrow, we have about 2.5 months. The House may take it upon itself to stop no deal. And enough MPs, I would suggest to the honourable gentleman, have said publicly that they will under no circumstances countenance a no deal. These people aren't simply going to sit on their hands and watch as the sands of the hour clock, the egg timer go down and run out. They're not going to sit on their hands simply to see no deal happen on the 29th of March. I would suggest to members of this House and this chamber that these people, bright people, skilled in parliamentary debate and procedure, will do all they can to frustrate no deal. They pretty much said that, and their actions have shown that. So a lot of my Brexiteer colleagues, I feel, show a remarkable degree of complacency about the fact that, oh, well, all we have to do is sit and wait and then no deal will take place. What I'm saying is that nobody knows. And I think that the best way of delivering Brexit, the clearest, most elegant, as I said, the simplest way of delivering Brexit, is simply to vote for the deal. I think the deal is not perfect. No deal is perfect. But the deal takes us forward. The deal takes us to the second stage of negotiations with the EU. The deal actually means that we leave, as the Honourable Member for Edinburgh East suggested, we leave the EU. He's quite honest. He says he doesn't want to leave the EU. That's why he's going to vote down the deal. But for Brexiteer colleagues to say that they want Brexit but will vote down the deal, while they will be marching in the division lobbies with people whose sole political aim is to frustrate Brexit, that seems to me extraordinary, that members who advocate Brexit will be linking metaphorically arm in arm with people who actually want to frustrate the whole project. The honourable member, the right honourable member for Beaconsfield, and my honourable friend for Morley and Outwood have radically different views about the nature of Brexit, about its purpose, about its good effects, as I see them and as she sees them. But they will probably be going in the same lobby. This is a crazy, frankly, situation. Thank you. Yeah.
The reason that we are going in the same lobby, or likely to go in the same lobby, is because, quite frankly, the government's failed to listen time and time again. I mean, behind closed doors, you know, we've all been having meetings with the Whip, with the Prime Minister, saying about our concerns for months, but it's fallen on deaf ears. So no wonder, with respect, we're in this situation because you've put a bad deal to the House.
Okay. Well, Minister. This illustrates exactly what I was going to say. And actually, in a funny way, it makes the argument for what I'm saying. You have a situation where two groups of people who think diametrically opposed things have come together to vote down the deal. One group thinks by voting down the deal they'll get to stay in the EU. One group thinks that by voting down the deal they'll get a more perfect Brexit. Both groups cannot be right. They can't. I mean, they're rational, intelligent people on both sides, yet they think completely diametrically opposed things are going to happen. This suggests to me that actually the deal is probably the best way forward, because by this sort of unholy alliance between principled Brexiteers, many of whom are close friends, people I respect, and people who have openly said that they would vote down Brexit itself, this unholy alliance shows to me very clearly that the deal is the only rational and sensible way forward in this debate.
Thank you. Thank you for giving way, Minister. Just a brief point. It takes a lot, actually, for somebody who has always been loyal with the party, the last decade or so that I've been a member, never voted against the government, and so as a lot of my colleagues in the Finders PPS have never voted against the government. And let's not forget, it's the Remain colleagues in our party who has been thwarting Brexit, who has voted against the government so far. But as I return to my previous point, had you provided a deal to the House, put a deal to the House, what was actually Brexit? I mean, I'm getting so many constituents who write to me who said, please vote that deal down. So it's you and the government and the Prime Minister who has done the job at actually uniting this side against your deal.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Minister, just a point of clarity, obviously it's not me, but Minister.
I understand that the forms
far from it.
and courtesies of debates in this place. Very briefly, I would urge her and her Brexiteers to vote for the deal, because I sincerely believe, and I'm not speaking simply as someone who is a government minister, I'm speaking as a Brexiteer, and my real worry is that Brexit itself will be abandoned as the Brexiteers are divided. Now, I'm a historian, I'm someone who loves reading about history. There are countless examples of situations when people have won what they were fighting for, and then they simply have fallen out. There have simply been divisions. And this is a very grave danger for Brexit. Having won the argument, having won the debate and won the referendum in 2016, we do see the Brexit side quite fractured. I, as a Brexiteer, support the deal. The honourable member for Sutton and Cheam, as a Brexiteer, supports the deal. And yet there are other Brexiteers in this chamber, let alone in the wider House of Commons, who feel that they support Brexit and cannot support the deal. I urge all Brexiteers, and I urge Remainers who want to see their manifesto's commitments actually fulfilled. And that's the entire Labour Party, in fact, if you look at their manifesto. I urge them to vote for the deal in order to push this country and move forward. I think any other outcome, voting down the deal, will add to the chaos and confusion and does, by necessity, imperil Brexit itself. But thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank all honourable members for their really excellent contributions to what was a very high-quality debate.
Thank you, Minister. Paul Scully, briefly to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the second half of the debate. Can I thank the Minister for that excellent speech, and can I thank everybody that's contributed for an interesting and informative points that everybody's made in such a constructive and passionate way, but respectful as well. You know, we've had a lot of passion running around the country. It's been running high, and we've seen the harassment, the bullying that's been on both sides, to whether it's the honourable friend from Broxtowe, whether it's the honourable friend from North East Somerset, and indeed the honourable friend from Morley and Atwood, and others who have suffered harassment, bullying and worse. What we have seen here is the fact that we can have polar opposite views, but we can tackle these in a constructive, passionate and respectful way. I know when I was actually on platforms arguing for Brexit, people were saying to me, well, what does your Brexit look like? And I was saying, actually, I can tell you what mine looks like, but that precludes you from having any say in it whatsoever if that's how it's going to be. We need to debate this. We need to discuss it. And people are actually saying, a number of people, well, if only it was like the common market, rather than the extra bits that we've had over the last 20 years. And ironically, the original Chequers white paper that was put out was closer to the white paper, to the common market. But it's important to remember this arrangement, this argument, this deal is not even Chequers, because a lot of that comes in the second half of the negotiations. We know that a referendum will not likely not to resolve anything. We cannot agree on the question, on the timetable, and how we'd even approach it in this place. So I cannot see how that referendum is going to work. And just revoking Article 50, because people find Brexit too difficult and put it in the too difficult box, is just not something that people will live with in this country. And that's the thing that saddened me in this House over the last couple of years in this debate, is just its paucity of ambition. It's paucity of ambition for our country to actually take what is going to be good about Brexit, whether it's in terms of reclaiming control, whether it's in terms of future trading arrangements. But we know there are going to be difficulties in the next few months to get to that place. But I'm confident and optimistic that we still can do that. And the Minister was absolutely right when he said that there are two sides there, and some of them, one of those sides is going to be wrong. They are going to lose and have the diametric opposite of what they want to happen. I'm not going to be a heroic loser. Now, if I'm wrong, if I've blinked too early, then these guys that have spoken, I will be the first to shake their hand. But I am going to make sure that we leave the EU, we leave it in an orderly fashion, and I thank everyone again. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered e-petitions 229963, 221747 and 235185 relating to leaving the EU without a withdrawal agreement, 232984 and 241361 relating to holding a further referendum on leaving the EU, and 226509 and 236261 relating to not leaving the EU. As many as have that opinion say aye. Or on the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Thank you. Order, order.